day, everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Tonight's story takes us to medieval Scotland, to a time of stolen crowns, occupied castles, and a man whose name still echoes through the centuries. Tonight, we're telling the true story of William Wallace. If you're new here, this is a place for slow, immersive history stories, told calmly with plenty of atmosphere, so you can relax, unwind, and if you'd like, drift off to sleep. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Drop your city or country in the comments. I always read them, and it's amazing seeing how far these stories travel. And if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, please subscribe, because I post long, relaxing historical journeys like this regularly, and it really helps the channel grow. All right, get comfortable, turn the lights down, take a deep breath. In the Scotland of William Wallace's youth, history didn't arrive with trumpets. It came like weather, slow, gray, and unavoidable, rolling in from the south in the shape of parchment, oaths, and armed men who spoke the language of law but carried the weight of steel. Long before the famous battles, long before Scotland's rebellion found its most enduring name, there was simply a country trying to keep its footing while the ground beneath it began to shift. We can't begin Wallace's story with the neat certainty people often want from a hero's origin, because the 13th century rarely offers that kindness. Even his birthplace is disputed, and the most dramatic stories of his early life come from much later tradition, shaped by poets and patriots, rather than contemporary witnesses. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Wallace was born around 1270 into a Scotland that was still independent, still ruled by its own kings, and still able, at least in principle, to decide its own quarrels without answering to anyone else. Yet even that independence rested on something as fragile as a lineage. When the chain of succession holds, a kingdom looks stable. When it snaps, everyone hears the sound. For most ordinary people, politics was not a debate in a hall. It was the feeling of a tax changing, the presence of unfamiliar officials, the tightening of obligations that once had been negotiated locally. Scotland in Wallace's early years was a patchwork of lordships and loyalties, shaped by kinship, land, and the rough logic of survival. Men of Wallace's class, the lesser nobility, the land-holding families who were not the greatest magnates but still carried influence, grew up learning how to fight, how to hold their place, and how quickly place could be taken away. We do not have a full roll of his childhood, but we do have a hard trace that cuts through later myth. A surviving seal attached to a letter, naming his father as Alan Wallace. It's not romantic, but it is real. A small piece of wax and Latin that places Wallace in the world of minor gentry rather than pure legend. Then, in 1286, the first great crack appeared. King Alexander III died suddenly. The kingdom did not fall apart that night, but it began to lean. His heir was his granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, still a child, still far away, more a promise than a ruler. When Margaret died in 1290, Scotland lost not only a person, but the easiest path to continuity. What followed was a succession crisis, the Great Cause. where multiple claimants argued their rights and powerful families watched each other with careful suspicion. In that moment of uncertainty, Scotland's leaders turned to the one figure they believed could impose order: Edward I of England. Edward was not simply a neighboring king with polite intentions. He was one of the most formidable monarchs of his age, a ruler who understood that power could be taken not only by swords, but by legal arguments backed by swords. Invited to arbitrate Scotland's succession, he arrived with the confidence of a man who believed he could define the terms of the question itself. He pressed claims of overlordship, and he made Scottish nobles perform humiliating submissions. The process that was meant to protect Scotland's independence instead opened a door that Edward would widen with every step. The throne was eventually awarded to John Balliol, but Balliol's reign was constantly constrained by Edward's demands. Scotland was treated less like a sovereign realm and more like a subordinate that could be summoned, instructed, and corrected. The tension between the two kingdoms grew sharper until it finally broke into open conflict. In 1296, Edward moved decisively. Scotland was invaded, defeated, and treated not as a partner, but as a conquered territory to be organized. Castles fell. Key towns were punished. The English administration set about doing what conquerors do best: turning conquest into routine. Sheriffs, constables, garrisons, and treasurers were installed to keep the system working. Occupation is not only a battle, it is the daily insistence that the conqueror's rules are now the only rules. This mattered because it changed the texture of life. People didn't need to read proclamations to feel the shift. They saw different banners over their towns, different men collecting revenues, different courts dispensing judgment. They heard the clank of foreign soldiers in places that had once been governed by familiar names. For Scottish lords, there were oaths to swear and humiliations to swallow. For those lower down, there was the constant question of what resistance would cost. In such a world, rebellion rarely begins as one clean national movement. It begins as small refusals, as local fights, as men who decide that the risk of action is no longer greater than the risk of submission. It is in this atmosphere that William Wallace emerges into the record as an actor rather than a rumor. Later centuries would prefer a single dramatic turning point: a murdered loved one, a personal vendetta, an oath in the night. Those tales exist, and they are powerful, but they mostly come from much later storytelling and cannot be treated as straightforward fact. The early contemporary record is thinner, harsher, and more believable. It suggests a man of fighting capacity and leadership, not among the richest magnates, but significant enough to gather others. A man shaped by a Scotland where English authority had become newly present and newly oppressive, and a man willing to strike not at anonymous soldiers, but at the officials who embodied occupation. In May 1297, Wallace's name becomes tied to a killing that carried political meaning: the death of William de Heselrigg, the English sheriff of Lanark. The details and popular retellings differ dramatically, but the core point remains steady across historical discussion. An English official, one of the visible hands of occupation, was killed, and Wallace became a marked man. Whatever he had been before, he was now a threat that could not be ignored. This was not simply violence for its own sake. It was violence aimed at authority, the kind that tells a community that the conqueror's representatives can be reached. From that point, Wallace's life becomes the life of a hunted leader, but also of a man who begins to attract others. Some joined him out of conviction, some out of anger, some because survival on the margins pushed them into the same rough brotherhood. Scotland's landscape offered cover and opportunity, woods for concealment, hills for observation, rivers and narrow roads for ambush. Resistance in this phase was often quick and sharp, a war of movement and disruption, rather than grand set-piece battles. Yet, even as Wallace's band grew, it remained only one part of a wider unrest. That wider unrest is crucial for telling the history. Honestly, Scotland was not waiting passively for one savior. Across the realm, pressure was building and breaking in multiple places. In the north, Andrew de Moray was leading a serious uprising, driving back English control and gathering support. These were not merely scattered criminals. They were local forces forming around leaders with regional credibility. In time, the separate flames began to recognize their shared need. Cooperation would mean stronger numbers, broader legitimacy, and the ability to challenge the English in a way that looked less like banditry and more like war. One of the clearest windows into that shift is a surviving document that feels almost startling in its practicality. Wallace and Moray, riding together, addressed the towns of Lubeck and Hamburg, encouraging the resumption of trade, now that, in their view, Scottish ports were open again. It is an extraordinary detail because it shows what the rebellion was trying to become. Not just fighting in the woods, but a political movement capable of speaking in the name of the kingdom, concerned with commerce, reputation, and the message Scotland sent beyond its borders. By late spring and early summer of 1297, the country had become a landscape of tense choices. English authority still felt dense in many places, rooted in castles and officials, but the rebellion had momentum, fed by resentment and the simple knowledge that the occupier's grip was not absolute. Wallace's actions had pushed his name into the wider struggle, yet the English response was inevitable. Occupations respond the way occupations always respond. They gather force, concentrate it, and attempt to crush the revolt in one decisive blow. In Scotland, that gathering force had to move along roads and cross rivers. And in the center of the country, the River Forth cut like a boundary line between two halves of a kingdom. North of it, Moray's strength mattered. South of it, English control remained sharp. Between them stood Stirling, with its castle, its roads, and the narrow bridge that could turn movement into vulnerability. That bridge was more than timber. It was a hinge in the war's next chapter, the place where scattered resistance could become a national victory if timing and terrain were used with ruthless intelligence. In the next chapter, Wallace and Moray will stop running. They will choose their ground. They will watch an English army commit itself step by step across the river. And when they strike, Scotland will not merely have a rebel leader. It will have a guardian. By late summer of 1297, Scotland felt like a land holding its breath. English garrisons sat inside stone castles like iron teeth in the gum of the country. Stirling, Roxburgh, Edinburgh, Berwick, each one a hard point of control. Roads were watched. Sheriffs collected dues. The machinery of occupation kept turning, even when the countryside grumbled and flinched. Yet the rebellion had not died after Lanark. If anything, it had grown bolder, as if the first strike had proven something important. The English could be hurt. But boldness alone doesn't win a war. The English response was always going to come. Disciplined, well-funded, heavy with cavalry, backed by the authority of a king who believed the very idea of Scottish independence was an inconvenience that could be corrected by force. So, the question for William Wallace and the rising resistance was simple and brutal. When the army comes, where do you stand? Because in the medieval world, a pitched battle could become a slaughterhouse. If you were outnumbered, out-armored, out-horsed, if you were the side with fewer knights, fewer trained men-at-arms, fewer resources, you didn't win by meeting strength with strength. You engineered a win. You let the landscape fight with you. You chose a place where the enemy's greatest advantages turned clumsy and narrow. In 1297, the landscape offered Wallace and his allies a gift wrapped in mud and timber, the River Forth and the bridge at Stirling. Stirling mattered because it sat near the gateway between north and south. Whoever controlled it could move troops and supplies between regions, pressure rebellious districts, and keep Scotland divided. The castle itself was formidable, perched above the approaches like a clenched fist. But the true choke point was the crossing. Bridges in this age were precious, narrow things. Many armies crossed rivers at fords, but for an army with wagons, equipment, and heavy cavalry, a bridge was often the only practical way to keep cohesion and move quickly. At Stirling, the bridge was long and tight, forcing men to pass in a stream. An army wouldn't arrive on the far bank as one solid mass. It would arrive like water poured through a spout. First a little, then more, until enough had crossed to feel confident, but not enough to be safe. If you struck at the right moment, you could isolate a portion of the enemy and destroy it before the rest could help. Wallace understood that, and so did Andrew de Moray. Moray's role matters because the rising of 1297 was not a single flame lit by one man. In the north, Moray had already driven a serious revolt, gathering men and striking at English power where it looked secure. Wallace and Moray were separate fires at first, and their eventual cooperation made the rebellion feel less like scattered fury and more like a national movement with two hands closing into one fist. The English force that moved toward Stirling in early September was led by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, with Hugh de Cressingham, Edward I's treasurer in Scotland, present as a key figure in the occupation's government. Surrey represented military authority, the weight of noble command, and the professional habits of war. Cressingham represented something colder, the occupation's paperwork, its money, its belief that Scotland could be managed like a ledger. They did not come to negotiate. They came to restore control, punish defiance, and break the sense that rebellion could stand in the open. Their army arrived near Stirling and faced the same problem any army faces before a river. You must cross or you must go around. There were choices. Delay, seek a ford, attempt a different crossing, bargain for time. But armies are expensive to keep in the field, and delay has a way of turning into weakness. The longer the English waited, the more rebels might gather, the more confidence would spread, the more Scottish nobles might hedge their loyalties. The occupation depended on decisiveness, so the English chose the bridge, and the Scots waited. Wallace and Moray held their men on higher ground near the north bank, in position to watch the crossing and descend quickly onto terrain that would confine the English. The Scottish force was not a polished uniform army. It was a mixture, men with spears, axes, knives, bows, and whatever armor they could manage. Some were trained, many were not, but they possessed an advantage that can outweigh training when used well. They knew exactly where the enemy had to go. They weren't guessing at a field. They were guarding a funnel. On 11th September, 1297, the English began crossing. You can almost hear it. Timber groaning beneath weight, boots thudding, bridles clinking, horses snorting and stamping as they were urged into a narrow line. In a wide river crossing, you can deploy in breadth. On a bridge, you become single file, then two abreast at best, your order determined by the planks under your feet. The river Forth moved beneath them, wide enough to matter, strong enough to punish mistakes. As the crossing continued, a significant English force built up on the north side, men-at-arms, knights, infantry, enough to fight, enough to feel that the Scots were about to be brushed aside, but not enough to be the whole army. The rest remained on the south bank, still waiting their turn, still trapped by the same narrow passage. Wallace and Moray did not strike too early. That patience is what turns a skirmish into a decisive battle. Attack too soon, and the English might pull back, regroup, find another route, or simply stop crossing and force the Scots to make the next move. Wait too long, and the full weight of the English army stands on your side of the river, and your advantage disappears. So they chose the moment when the English had committed, when enough had crossed to be vulnerable, and when the bridge itself, crowded and strained, would become an obstacle rather than an escape. Then the Scots moved. They came down hard on the English, who had crossed and were trying to organize. The ground on the north bank narrowed their options. Cavalry needs space to build speed, to wheel, to break a line. In a confined area, horses become frightened and constrained, and the energy that makes a charge devastating turns into confusion and collision. Infantry formations need room to expand, to rotate units, to keep the wounded flowing back and the fresh men forward. The bridge behind the English, which should have been their lifeline, became a choke point. Suddenly, men who wanted to cross forward met men who wanted to retreat. Officers shouted commands that could not carry through the din. Horses balked as bodies and weapons pressed in too close. The neat idea of a disciplined crossing turned into a knot of panic. The Scots, fighting closer, pressing with spears and blades, used the crush to their advantage. At this distance, armor matters, but so do numbers, momentum, and the ability to surround. Even knights can die when they are hemmed in, separated, and forced into ground they cannot control. In the violence of the fight, Hugh de Cressingham was killed. Chroniclers hostile to him later lingered over his death with a grim satisfaction, because he symbolized more than a man. He symbolized the occupation's taxation and administration. The humiliation of being managed by outsiders. His end fed the sense that this was not merely a battlefield victory, but a tearing out of the occupation's nerve. Whether the bridge collapsed from strain, was damaged in the chaos, or was rendered unusable by sheer congestion, is debated in the surviving accounts, and later retellings often sharpen the story into a dramatic single moment. But the practical outcome was the same. The bridge stopped functioning as an orderly link. The English south of the river could not effectively reinforce or rescue the English trapped on the north bank. Those trapped men found themselves pressed toward the water, toward marshy ground, toward the deadly choice between fighting in a crush or risking the river. And medieval rivers do not forgive armor. Many drowned. Others were cut down trying to reach the crossing. The English force on the north side, unable to deploy properly and unable to withdraw cleanly, collapsed into defeat. On the far bank, Surrey faced the disaster with the rest of his army still divided from the fight, still unable to bring full strength to bear. He withdrew, saving what he could, abandoning the field rather than feeding more men into a trap. Stirling Bridge was not a lucky win. It was a victory built from patience, terrain, and timing. An answer to the central problem Scotland faced. The Scots could not afford to trade blows in an open field against England's advantages, but they could turn a crossing into a knife and force English strength to arrive in pieces. Yet, even decisive victories leave wounds, and one of the most significant belonged to Andrew de Moray. Moray was badly wounded in the campaign around Stirling, likely during or soon after the battle, and those wounds would later prove fatal. His loss would change the shape of the resistance. Moray was not only a fighter, he was a noble with regional power, a man whose position could help bind rebellion to legitimacy. Without him, Wallace would carry more of the burden alone, and the political ground beneath him would become less stable, even as his fame grew. In the immediate aftermath, though, Scotland had achieved something astonishing. A major English field force had been shattered. The occupation had been shown to be breakable, not only through raids and ambushes, but in a battle that could not be dismissed as mere banditry. The victory breathed confidence into the countryside and fear into garrisons that had assumed their walls, and their king would protect them. Wallace's stature changed overnight. He was no longer a local rebel leader. He became the figure most associated with the rebellion's success, and soon he would be recognized as Guardian of Scotland, acting in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. That detail matters, because it shows Wallace was not claiming a crown for himself. He was trying to hold the kingdom together, to represent Scotland as a functioning political community rather than a collection of angry bands. After Stirling, the rebellion had to become more than fighting. It had to become governance, alliances, supplies, diplomacy, and the image of legitimacy. But Stirling Bridge also made Wallace impossible for Edward I to ignore. Kings can tolerate unrest. Kings can tolerate local violence. What kings cannot tolerate is a victory that makes their authority look weak. Edward would respond not with a small punitive force, but with the full weight of royal war. Stirling was the day the river took Scotland's side. The next chapter will be the day England's king gathers himself to end the revolt in person. And Wallace, now bearing the hope and fear of a nation, walks toward the battle that will test whether clever ground and fierce will can stand against overwhelming power. Because the road from Stirling leads to Falkirk, and at Falkirk, the price of being a symbol will begin to show. The victory at Stirling Bridge did not end the war. It changed its shape. For a brief time after September 1297, Scotland looked like a country that had slipped its chains. English confidence had been cracked in a way that could not be explained away as a mere riot. A major field army had been beaten in a battle, fought on ground the Scots chose, at a crossing they controlled with patience and nerve. News like that travels faster than messengers. It moves through markets, through monasteries, through the halls of lords who measure their loyalty by the direction the wind is blowing. It moves through fear, too. Fear inside English garrisons now wondering whether their walls were enough. And fear among Scots who had lived under occupation long enough to know the punishment that could follow. In the medieval world, a victory creates a new kind of danger. It does not only lift spirits, it raises expectations. It tells people you might win, and once a people begins to believe that, they start to demand more than survival. They demand direction. That is where William Wallace found himself in the months after Stirling. Not only a fighter, but a symbol pressed into the shape of authority. Andrew de Moray, wounded in the struggle around Stirling, did not recover. His death removed from the rebellion, a leader with noble standing and strong northern support. Exactly the kind of figure who could have shared the political burden Wallace was about to carry. With Moray gone, the focus narrowed. Wallace's name stood larger, and the work of holding Scotland together fell more heavily on him. At some point in the months after Stirling, Wallace was recognized as Guardian of Scotland, acting in the name of the deposed King John Balliol. That formula mattered. It was an attempt to frame the rebellion as lawful guardianship rather than personal ambition. Wallace was not declaring himself king. He was claiming to protect a kingdom whose rightful order had been broken by conquest. But even that careful framing could not solve the central problem. Scotland needed leadership that could coordinate nobles who did not always trust each other, supply an army with limited resources, and face an English king who had the wealth and machinery to return in force. For Wallace, guardianship was not a crown. It was a weight. The winter that followed Stirling was harsh in more ways than weather. War eats. It devours grain, cattle, horses, and the patience of communities trying to live between marching forces. The Scots had proved they could win a battle, but sustaining a war required food, money, and political unity, things Scotland could not summon as easily as courage. Wallace needed to keep momentum alive before nobles drifted back into cautious submission, and before English administrators rebuilt their grip. So, the war spilled south. In late 1297, Wallace led raids into northern England, including into Northumberland, and as far as Carlisle, depending on the source and interpretation. These incursions had a logic that was both strategic and psychological. Strategically, raiding could gather supplies and disrupt English preparations. Psychologically, it sent a message. The border was not a shield. England, too, could feel the insecurity Scotland had endured. Yet, raids, also carried a moral cost. Medieval warfare was often brutal, and raids could mean burned settlements and suffering among civilians. Later traditions sometimes paint them as righteous punishment. English records treat them as devastation. The truth is that war at this level rarely stays clean. Wallace's campaign was aimed at sustaining a rebellion, and rebellions often feed on what they can take. At the same time, Wallace's government tried to present itself as something more than armed bands. The famous letter to Lubeck and Hamburg, written jointly by Wallace and Moray earlier, and reflecting the movement's political voice, points to this ambition: to keep trade flowing, to show foreign towns and merchants that Scotland had authority at its ports and in its dealings. To fight England, Scotland needed more than swords. It needed recognition, if not formal alliances, at least the sense that it still existed as a realm worth trading with and speaking to. But this fragile effort at statehood was built in the shadow of a single looming fact. Edward I would not allow Stirling to stand as the new normal. Edward was not a monarch who could shrug off humiliation. He had conquered Wales and built a system of castles and administration that turned victory into permanence. He believed in overlordship, in the idea that Scotland's defiance was not only rebellion, but insolence, and he had the resources to act. So in 1298, the king came north with a large army. The exact numbers are argued over by historians, and medieval figures often swell or shrink depending on the storyteller. But the scale was undeniable. This was not a local expedition. It was a royal campaign built to crush resistance with overwhelming force. Edward's army combined heavy cavalry, infantry, and, crucially, skilled archers, particularly the longbowmen, whose effectiveness would become one of England's most feared advantages in the coming century. Wallace knew he could not meet Edward on equal terms. He could not afford a straightforward battle on open ground where cavalry could charge freely, and archers could work without interference. His best hope lay in the same principles that had won at Stirling. Choose terrain, control movement, deny the enemy the ability to fight the way it wanted to fight. Yet Stirling had offered a perfect choke point, a bridge that forced the English to arrive in pieces. The summer of 1298 offered no such gift. As Edward advanced, Wallace's strategy appears to have involved avoiding a pitched battle, scorched earth tactics, withdrawing supplies, making the English march hungry and frustrated through a hostile landscape. It was an ugly strategy, because it meant hardship for Scots as well as English, but it was a rational one against a stronger force. If Edward's army could be starved, delayed, and drained, it might become vulnerable to an ambush or forced to retreat. But great armies do not always retreat when hungry. Sometimes they become more dangerous. By July, Edward's army reached the area near Falkirk. There, circumstances, whether pressure, miscalculation, the difficulty of endless withdrawal, or the presence of enemy forces that could not be ignored, brought Wallace to battle. Falkirk was not Stirling Bridge. There was no narrow crossing to divide the English. It was open enough for cavalry to matter, and wide enough for archers to do their work. Wallace's army arranged itself around a defensive formation that had become the Scots' best answer to cavalry: the schiltron. A schiltron was, at its simplest, a dense formation of spearmen. their long weapons angled outward to form a bristling hedge. Against a horse charge, a properly held schiltron could be deadly. Horses will not willingly run onto a forest of spear points, and if forced, they break and tumble, throwing riders into chaos. At its best, the schiltron could turn cavalry from a hammer into a useless weight. At Falkirk, the Scots formed multiple schiltrons, described in some accounts as circular or rounded masses, like living forts of spears. Between and around them were other troops, men with lighter weapons, and a contingent of archers. The Scottish cavalry, such as it was limited and not comparable to England's. The formation was a statement. Wallace was trying to make his army into an immovable object that cavalry could not smash. Edward's forces approached with the confidence of men who had fought and won many times before. The English cavalry charged, and here the schiltrons did what they were designed to do. The spearmen held, and the horses could not simply punch through. If the battle had remained only a contest between spears and horsemen, Scotland might have endured. But England had another tool, and Edward knew exactly how to use it. The English archers moved into position and began to shoot into the packed Scottish formations. This is the nightmare of dense infantry, the very tightness that makes you strong against cavalry, makes you vulnerable to arrows. In an open line, men can move, duck, scatter. In a schiltron, men are shoulder to shoulder, bound by the need to hold the spear wall. When arrows fall into that mass, they do not need perfect aim. They only need volume. The schiltrons began to bleed. Once the spearmen were disrupted, once gaps appeared, once men fell and the lines wavered, cavalry could return to its role. A formation that is perfect is hard to break. A formation that is wounded becomes a target. Some accounts suggest the Scottish archers were outmatched or quickly overwhelmed, leaving the schiltrons exposed. There are also stories of Scottish nobles and cavalry withdrawing from the field, whether out of fear, calculation, or lack of unity. A recurring theme in Scotland's struggle, where personal interests sometimes competed with national necessity. The truth is difficult to pin down in every detail, but the outcome is not. The Scots were defeated. Falkirk was not merely a lost battle. It was a lesson written in blood about what Scotland faced when England fought at full capacity with king, cavalry, and archers coordinated. Wallace's tactics could not always conjure a bridge to turn the enemy's strength into weakness. On open ground, Edward could adapt. He could use archers to soften, cavalry to exploit, and discipline to finish. Wallace survived. That fact alone mattered. Many leaders die in defeat. Wallace remained alive, and that allowed him to remain a symbol and a continuing threat. But survival did not erase the political consequence. After Falkirk, Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland. He had carried the burden of leadership through victory and into catastrophe, and now the struggle would require new arrangements. Other nobles stepping forward, new alliances formed, old rivalries managed. His resignation is sometimes misunderstood as disappearance. It was not the end of Wallace's resistance. It was the end of Wallace's brief period as the central public authority of the rebellion. After Falkirk, the war did not end. It hardened. It became more complicated, more political, more desperate. Scotland's cause would continue under new guardians, and the eventual rise of Robert the Bruce would reshape everything. But in the wake of Falkirk, one truth stood cold and unavoidable. Wallace had shown Scotland how to win. Edward had shown Scotland how hard winning would remain. And now, with his authority diminished but his name burning brighter than ever, Wallace moved into the next phase of his life. One fought in the shadows of betrayal, shifting loyalties, and the long reach of a king who did not forget. After Falkirk, the air around William Wallace changed. Before, he had been a rising leader in a rising rebellion, carried upward by victory and the sudden hunger of a nation for someone who could stand in the open. After, he became something else, more dangerous in one way, more vulnerable in another. His legend was growing, but his position had narrowed. He was no longer the public face of Scotland's government. He was not, now, the man who could command all factions with the authority of office. He was a leader without a seat, a soldier without the official mantle. And in the medieval world, those were the easiest people to call criminals when they could not be defeated cleanly on a battlefield. Wallace resigned as Guardian of Scotland after the defeat. That act alone tells you how severe the consequences of Falkirk were, not only in blood, but in confidence and unity. Scotland's resistance had always been a coalition of necessity, stitched together from nobles, local leaders, and men who fought because they had little left to lose. Victory could hold such a coalition together. Defeat pulled at every seam. In the months that followed, leadership shifted to men with greater noble standing. Figures like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn would come forward in varying combinations, sometimes cooperating, sometimes rivaling each other, sometimes forced into uneasy arrangements because the alternative was English domination. Wallace remained part of the resistance, but he moved now as a hunted man. It is tempting, in later storytelling, to make Wallace's hunted years a clean arc of righteous guerrilla war. Him, always noble, always pure, always supported by the people. The reality was almost certainly messier. A man in his position needed food, weapons, shelter, information, and horses. That meant networks of supporters and safe houses, men who could guide him through woods and moors, families willing to risk reprisal by offering bread and a place to sleep. It also meant the constant danger that any one of those people could be threatened, bribed, or broken. English rule did not only fight with swords, it fought with hostages, fines, confiscations, and the terrifying power to punish entire communities for the acts of one man. And England was learning Edward I had suffered surprise at Stirling. He would not offer the same gift again. After Falkirk, English strategy hardened into a grim patience. Take castles, restore administration, pressure nobles into submission, and isolate the remaining insurgents until they were no longer leaders of a nation, but fugitives with dwindling choices. In 1299, Scotland tried to keep its resistance organized through new guardianship arrangements, attempts to build a governing structure even while the war continued. But these arrangements were constantly threatened by internal rivalry. The rivalry between Comyn and Bruce in particular was not merely personal. It was about power, legitimacy, and competing claims that would shape Scotland's future. Each faction had followers. Each had interests. Each had reasons to cooperate against England. and reasons to distrust the other. Wallace, as a man outside the greatest noble circles, could be admired as a symbol, yet treated as politically inconvenient. He was useful when the cause needed fire, and awkward when the cause needed negotiation. This is part of the tragedy of Wallace's story. He was indispensable to Scotland's awakening, but not always welcome in Scotland's bargaining. Sometime after Falkirk, Wallace appears to have left Scotland, at least briefly, on a mission that later writers framed as diplomatic. The details are uncertain and debated, but the general idea is plausible. Scotland needed allies, recognition, support, anything that could tilt the balance against England. France was the obvious destination, because England and France were entangled in their own disputes, and because the Auld Alliance tradition between Scotland and France would later become central to Scottish foreign policy. Whether Wallace met high officials, whether he reached the French court, whether he sought support from the papacy, later accounts expand these possibilities, but the evidence is thin and uneven. Still, the very existence of such stories tells you what the Scots needed at that moment. Not just spears in fields, but legitimacy in Europe. If Wallace did travel abroad, it would have been dangerous, complicated, and uncertain. A fugitive crossing borders is not a prince arriving with retinue. He would have depended on contacts, on sympathetic clerics, on merchants who knew which ports were safer, on men who could hide him in plain sight. And even if he gained sympathetic hearing, sympathy does not always translate into armies. European politics was a web, and Scotland was only one thread. Eventually, Wallace returned to the war on Scottish soil because the war had not paused in his absence. Edward kept coming. Castle by castle, the English worked to turn Scotland back into an occupied territory that could function even under resentment. And in those years, one of Edward's strongest weapons was Scottish submission. In medieval wars, conquest is rarely complete until local elites accept it, whether sincerely or out of fear. Edward demanded oaths. He demanded homage. He demanded hostages, and some Scottish nobles, exhausted or calculating, gave him what he wanted, at least outwardly. Others resisted longer. Some shifted back and forth, trying to survive in a political storm where choosing wrong could ruin a family for generations. From a distance, it can look like betrayal. Up close, it can look like a man trying to keep his lands from being burned and his children from being taken. But for Wallace, every oath sworn to Edward was another door closing. His power had always been bound up with the idea that Scotland could resist. If the nobility surrendered, if the castles opened, if the councils bent the knee, then Wallace's resistance would be painted as banditry, no matter how patriotic his motives remained. And that was exactly how Edward wanted it. The king did not only want Wallace defeated, he wanted him stripped of political meaning, reduced to a criminal, so that his execution would look like justice rather than martyrdom. As the years moved toward 1303 and 1304, Edward launched renewed campaigns to finish what remained. The pressure increased. Strongholds that had held out were reduced. The sense that Scotland could hold the line weakened. Even major leaders who had fought against England found themselves forced into submission when the alternatives became too bleak. By 1304, The resistance in its earlier form was largely broken. A Scotland that had tasted the possibility of victory was pushed back under occupation's heavy hand, and Wallace was still out there. That fact alone is extraordinary, because it means that, even as castles fell and nobles submitted, Wallace continued to evade capture. He continued to move in a Scotland that was becoming more dangerous to him every month. His survival depended on secrecy and speed, on the loyalty of a shrinking circle, and on the simple truth that the land itself could hide a man if enough people chose not to speak. Yet the net was tightening. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with being a symbol in a losing phase of a war. When things are going well, a symbol is celebrated and protected. When things are going badly, the same symbol becomes a risk. Harboring Wallace might mean the loss of your home. Feeding his men might mean execution. Even those who admired him could fear him, not as a person, but as a consequence. And Edward's government understood that pressure applied to ordinary people can reach a fugitive better than any knight's sword. Rewards, threats, promises of pardon. These tools could turn one frightened man into an informant. In the end, that is often how fugitive leaders are caught, not through battlefield skill, but through a moment of human weakness in a world that has been starved and punished long enough. By 1304, Wallace's war was no longer about commanding armies. It was about continuing to exist as resistance made flesh. Every day he remained free was a reminder that Scotland was not fully conquered. Every day he lived was a rebuke to Edward's authority, and because of that, Wallace became a personal target, wanted not merely for military reasons, but for what his continued freedom said about English control. He was, in a sense, the last open wound. The next part of his story moves toward inevitability, but not toward quiet. It moves toward betrayal, capture, and the performance of power that medieval kings used to make fear permanent. Wallace's enemies did not want him simply dead. They wanted him broken in public, so that his end would warn every Scottish village and every wavering lord what defiance costs. And yet, the deeper tragedy is this: the very violence meant to erase his meaning would be the thing that fixed his meaning forever. Because the moment Wallace is finally taken, the war does not end. It changes hands, and the name that England tries to extinguish becomes the spark that later leaders will use again and again, until Scotland rises in a new form, with a new king, and with vengeance sharpened by memory. By 1305, William Wallace had become less a commander and more a problem that refused to go away. Scotland had been pressed down under English force with a kind of methodical cruelty. Castles reduced, councils bent, oaths gathered like harvest. Many of the men who had once opposed Edward had submitted, at least outwardly, because the alternatives were ruin and death. English administration was being rebuilt again, not as a temporary occupation, but as a permanent system meant to make Scottish resistance seem childish and futile. And yet Wallace remained free. That was intolerable, not because one man could still raise an army equal to Edward's. He could not. But because one man still uncaptured, still moving through the country, still spoken of in low voices, meant the conquest was not complete. In the medieval imagination, kingship was not only about controlling land, it was about controlling the story of land. A king ruled by being seen to rule. Wallace, alive and unbroken, challenged that visibility. Edward wanted him taken, and he wanted it done in a way that would make the taking itself a lesson. The capture came in the late summer, in August 1305, at a place near Glasgow, often identified as Robroyston. It is one of the bitterest points in Wallace's story, because like so many endings of hunted men, it is tied to betrayal. Later tradition names John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who was aligned with Edward's administration, as the man who delivered Wallace into English hands. The specifics of exactly how the arrest unfolded are difficult to reconstruct with perfect certainty, but the general shape is clear. Wallace was seized by men acting for the English, and the Scottish collaboration that Edward cultivated played a role. There is a stark psychological cruelty in that. Conquest does not only defeat a country, it tries to make the country participate in its own defeat. To have Wallace captured not by a foreign army on a battlefield, but through the machinery of English-controlled Scotland, was part of the point. It said to every Scot, your own people can be made to hunt you, your own land can be made to trap you, and your own safety can be traded for pardon. Once captured, Wallace was moved quickly toward London. The journey itself would have been a procession of power, not a simple transport. A king's enemies were not merely killed, they were displayed. Along the road, towns could see that the famous rebel was now bound and powerless. The myth of his invincibility, already growing in popular imagination, was meant to be punctured. Chains were part of the message. London in 1305 was not just a city. It was a symbol of English authority and royal justice. Bringing Wallace there was a deliberate act to define him not as a Scottish leader in a war between kingdoms, but as a criminal brought to the proper court of the proper king. It was a legal framing meant to erase the political reality that Wallace had fought as a patriot in a contested realm. Edward wanted the record to say traitor, because traitor is what you call a rebel inside your own dominion. If Scotland was truly England's to command, then Wallace was not an enemy commander. He was an outlaw. The trial was staged accordingly. Wallace was charged with treason and other crimes. The central accusation, that he had betrayed the King of England, was a grim kind of logic. Wallace's answer, as later accounts preserve it, cut through that logic with a simple refusal. He could not be Edward's traitor because he had never sworn loyalty to Edward. Whether the exact phrasing has been polished by retelling or not, the principle is consistent with the political reality Wallace would have claimed. He fought for Scotland, not against a king he acknowledged as his own. But Edward's court was not interested in debate. Trials of famous enemies in this period were often performances with predetermined outcomes, especially when the purpose was deterrence. Wallace was not on trial to discover truth. He was on trial to create a public narrative of justice The punishment selected was the most extreme available for treason in England. Execution meant to be both death and spectacle. It was the state speaking in a language of horror, insisting that the body of the rebel would become a warning sign. On 23rd August 1305, Wallace was taken to Smithfield in London for execution. Accounts describe him being dragged through the streets, a humiliation designed to strip dignity and display dominance. The method of execution, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was meant not only to kill, but to annihilate the condemned person's symbolic power. In a world where honor mattered, the degradation was part of the punishment. It is difficult to describe such events without turning them into lurid detail, and a historically grounded telling should be careful here. The essential truth is already grim enough. Wallace was executed in a way designed to maximize suffering and to make the act unforgettable to witnesses. This was not simply death. It was theater, royal theater, where the kingdom was invited to watch what happens to those who defy the crown. Afterward, Wallace's body was divided, and parts were sent to different locations, displayed in places like Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, according to traditional accounts, as a further warning. The message was explicit. The rebellion's most famous figure had been destroyed, and his remains would stand as markers of English reach. But power often misunderstands the chemistry of martyrdom. Edward intended Wallace's death to end the story. Yet public brutality can have the opposite effect. When a cause loses a leader in battle, it can be framed as misfortune. When a cause loses a leader on a scaffold, especially a leader whose fame has already begun to crystallize, his death becomes a narrative engine. It becomes something people repeat and retell and carry forward. The execution meant to terrify can harden resolve because it removes the possibility of compromise. It turns resistance into memory, and memory into obligation. For Scots hearing of Wallace's death, the details would not have been just news. They would have been a wound, even for those who had submitted, even for those trying to survive under occupation. The killing of Wallace in London could feel like a declaration that Scotland's dignity itself had been dragged and displayed. It made the conquest personal again. It reminded people that this was not merely politics, it was domination. And yet, in the cold calculation of Edward's policy, there was a reason for this cruelty. Wallace's existence threatened English legitimacy. If Wallace lived, he might inspire renewed uprising. If Wallace was killed quietly, he might inspire renewed uprising anyway. But if Wallace was killed publicly, grotesquely, and framed as a traitor, Edward hoped to poison the well, to teach people to associate resistance with disgrace. The tragedy is that it did not work as intended, because the claim that Wallace was a traitor depended on the claim that Scotland belonged to Edward, and Scotland, even in defeat, did not fully believe that. The very charge became a kind of insult that sharpened Scottish identity. Wallace's refusal, whether in exact words or in spirit, echoed what many Scots felt. He was not a criminal. He was a defender. What Edward did accomplish was to remove Wallace from the chessboard. Wallace could no longer lead men, raid supply lines, or serve as the rallying figure whose name could draw new fighters out of fear. In that sense, Edward did win a victory in 1305, but the war was not finished because wars of independence are not solved by killing one man. They are solved by changing the political reality that produced rebellion in the first place. And that reality still existed. An occupied kingdom, resentful nobles, and a population that had seen, if only briefly, that England could be beaten. Wallace's death created a vacuum of one kind and a pressure of another. It removed the old symbol, and it made room for a new leader to step fully into the center of the struggle. That leader was already present, already powerful, already complicated. Robert the Bruce. Within months, Scotland would erupt again, not in the same shape as before, but in a form that would eventually succeed where earlier efforts failed. Wallace's martyrdom would become part of the fuel. His name would be used to remind men of what had been done and what must be answered. So the story does not end at Smithfield. It turns. In the next chapter, we move into the year after Wallace's execution, when Robert the Bruce makes a decision that will set Scotland on a new path, one paved with blood, strategy, and a slow, relentless rebuilding of hope. When William Wallace died in London in August 1305, Edward I believed he had cut the heart out of Scotland's defiance. Wallace's execution was meant to be final, in the way only kings can imagine finality. A public ending that would make future resistance feel not only dangerous, but shameful. In practical terms, Edward had reason to hope. Scotland's major leaders had been pressured into submission. English administration was being re-established. The machinery of conquest, the sheriffs, the courts, the garrisons, was being made to look permanent. But conquest has a weakness that victory sometimes hides. It demands cooperation from the conquered. It demands that Scottish nobles and communities accept, day after day, that England has the right to command them, and that acceptance can be forced for a time, but it rarely becomes comfortable. The more England tightened its grip, the more it created conditions where a single decisive act could make the whole system feel brittle again. In the months after Wallace's death, Scotland was quiet, in the way a forest is quiet before a storm. People watched. They waited. Some prayed the war was finally over. Others carried resentment like a coal, hidden but hot. Nobles who had submitted to Edward did not all do so out of loyalty. Many did it because Edward's presence left them no safe alternative. Submission in those circumstances is not peace. It is postponement. The man who would break that postponement was Robert the Bruce. Bruce was not a newcomer to this story. He belonged to one of Scotland's most powerful families, and he carried something Wallace never could, a plausible claim to the throne. That claim was not an abstract genealogy. It was political reality. In a medieval war, legitimacy mattered almost as much as victory. Wallace had fought as a guardian, a defender, a leader of men, but he did not have the natural authority that came from being one of the great magnates with a royal claim. Bruce did. Yet Bruce was also, by necessity and temperament, a man of shifting alignments. He had at times cooperated with Edward, at times leaned toward resistance, and at times maneuvered in the gray space between, trying to keep his power intact while the country burned around him. It is easy to judge that from a distance, to call it indecision or opportunism, but in truth, it was the normal condition of Scotland's elite during this period. The English king was not merely a military threat, he was a political gravity well. He could confiscate lands, elevate rivals, and destroy families. The choice was rarely between courage and cowardice. It was often between two different ways of losing. What changed in 1306 was that Bruce, for reasons that combine ambition, danger, and perhaps a sense that the moment could not be delayed any longer, decided to make a break so absolute there could be no going back. There was one obstacle above all others: John Comyn. Comyn was not just a rival noble. He was at the center of a powerful faction connected to the Balliol claim and deeply entangled in the politics of Scottish resistance and submission. If Bruce wanted to lead Scotland, he needed more than soldiers. He needed unity, or at least the elimination of the most dangerous internal rival. Scotland had already learned, painfully, that it could not defeat England while tearing itself apart from within. The confrontation came at Dumfries, at the Church of the Greyfriars, in February 1306. The setting matters because it reveals the intensity of the moment. A church was supposed to be sanctuary. It was supposed to be a place where violence stopped at the threshold. And yet, inside that sacred space, Bruce and Comyn met in a confrontation that ended with Comyn stabbed. Whether Bruce struck the fatal blow himself, or whether others finished it in the immediate aftermath, the effect was the same. A murder committed in a holy place. A political act so shocking, it removed any possibility of pretending this was a minor quarrel. Bruce had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The consequences were immediate and enormous. By killing Comyn, Bruce did not only remove a rival, he declared war on the Comyn faction and exposed himself to the full fury of English retaliation. Edward I could now frame Bruce not merely as a rebel, but as a murderer and a sacrilegious criminal. The church itself was outraged. Bruce risked excommunication, and in a medieval society that still feared spiritual consequences, that mattered. But Bruce also gained something from the very enormity of the act: clarity. There was no longer a question of whether he would submit to Edward. He could not. Even if he wanted to, the Commons would never forgive, and Edward would never trust. So Bruce did the only thing that made sense after such a leap. He claimed the crown. In March 1306, Robert the Bruce was crowned King of Scots at Scone. The ceremony carried symbolism that Scotland desperately needed. After years of occupation and uncertainty, a coronation was a declaration that Scotland still considered itself a kingdom with its own ruler. But the coronation was also incomplete and strained. Scotland's traditional sacred regalia, including the Stone of Destiny, had been taken by Edward years earlier. Powerful factions opposed Bruce. Many nobles were hesitant. The English were watching closely. Bruce became king not at the end of a struggle, but at the start of one, and he began his reign with danger pressing in from every side. Edward's response was swift. He sent forces north and unleashed a campaign aimed at crushing Bruce before his kingship could take root. Bruce's support was real, but it was fragile. His army was not yet an established national force. It was a gathering, men drawn by loyalty, by calculation, by hope, and by the simple desire not to be last to choose sides. In the early months, Bruce attempted to assert his authority and build momentum. There were clashes, shifting loyalties, towns and castles that mattered, but Edward's commanders moved with experience and resources Bruce could not match. In June 1306, Bruce suffered a major defeat at Methven, near Perth, against English forces under Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke. The defeat was not just a loss, it was a collapse of security. Bruce's men were scattered. His ability to hold territory was undermined. The feeling that his kingship might be a brief, doomed flare became stronger. After Methven, the war became intimate and desperate. Bruce was no longer a king marching with an army. He was a fugitive king, moving with a shrinking band through hostile country, hunted by English forces and by Scottish enemies who saw advantage in his destruction. Another hard blow followed at Dalry, often linked with the pass of Brander area, where forces associated with a common faction inflicted further losses. Bruce's position, already precarious, began to look almost impossible. And then, the punishment reached into his family. Edward's conquest had always relied on a brutal truth. To break resistance, you attack not only leaders, but the people around them. Bruce's supporters were hunted. His brothers were captured. Members of his family were taken and imprisoned. And the nature of their treatment, public humiliation, harsh captivity, was meant to make an example. The message was the same one Edward had tried to carve into Scotland with Wallace's execution. Defiance will not only kill you, it will ruin everyone tied to you. This was the moment when Bruce's story could have ended as Wallace's did, captured, tried, and destroyed before his cause ever matured. Instead, Bruce vanished into the margins. The tradition of Bruce's flight includes stories of hiding in wild places, of narrow escapes, of loyalty tested by hunger and fear. Some later tales, like the famous spider story, are moral parables more than reliable history, but they reflect a real human truth. Bruce's survival depended on endurance. He had to keep moving. He had to avoid becoming pinned down. He had to live long enough for English momentum to exhaust itself, and for Scotland's resentment to find him again. For a time, Bruce appears to have gone to the Western Isles, and possibly to Ireland, relying on the networks of the Gaelic world. Sea routes, island strongholds, kinship ties that did not bend as easily to English authority as lowland castles did. Geography became his ally, in a way it had been for Wallace. The edge of Scotland, the rough coast, the islands, the places English armies struggled to control, offered a kind of breathing space. Not peace, but room. And in that room, the war's logic began to turn. Edward's power was immense, but it had limits. Armies could not be everywhere at once. Garrisons could not occupy every glen and island. English strength was best in open country and organized campaigns. Bruce, like Wallace before him, was learning to fight a different kind of war, one built on sudden strikes, local knowledge, and the slow, careful rebuilding of support. Most important of all, Bruce's kingship, however battered, had given Scotland something Wallace could not: a legal, dynastic center around which resistance could reorganize. Wallace had been a guardian of a broken realm. Bruce was now the realm's claimed king. Even in defeat, that claim mattered. It gave the struggle a new shape, one that could, over time, attract nobles who wanted a future, not under Edward's shadow. By the end of 1306, Scotland was not free. Bruce was not secure. The English occupation still looked powerful, and the forces against Bruce, both English and Scottish, were real and bitter. But the story had shifted again, in the way it always shifts in wars that aren't truly finished. The cause had found a new vessel. Wallace had shown Scotland that England could be beaten. Bruce, battered and hunted, was beginning to learn how to survive long enough to prove it could be beaten permanently. And as the next year dawned, a new phase began, one not built on a single great battle, but on a relentless campaign of return, where Bruce would step back onto Scottish soil, not as a fugitive begging for shelter, but as a king determined to take his kingdom back, piece by piece. When the year 1307 arrived, Robert the Bruce was still, in many eyes, a doomed king. He had been crowned, beaten, scattered, and hunted. His enemies had not merely defeated him in the field, they had tried to tear out the roots of his support, capturing relatives, executing allies, and making public examples of those who had chosen his side. Edward I's government believed it was only a matter of time before Bruce was cornered and finished. But time does strange things in a war like this. The longer it lasts, the more the simple fact of endurance becomes persuasive. Survive long enough, and even men who do not love you begin to consider you inevitable. Bruce's first task was not glory, it was return. He had spent part of his flight in the western reaches, places where sea routes mattered as much as roads, where kinship and local loyalties could shelter a man better than the stone walls of a lowland castle, and where English military power was powerful, but not effortless. The West was not a romantic refuge. It was harsh, wet, and uncertain. But it offered something that was rare in these years: the possibility to move without being seen, to gather strength without immediately being crushed by a royal army. In early 1307, Bruce came back toward the Scottish mainland with a small force and a desperate kind of clarity. He could not compete with English resources, so he did not try. He struck where English control was thin, where local allies could be found, and where victory, any victory, could be turned into momentum. The war he began to wage looked less like formal medieval campaigning, and more like a deliberate, patient dismantling of occupation. It was a war of returns to places that had turned him away. He started in the southwest, in territories where he had familial ties and where the local politics were tangled but not hopeless. The key was to create a chain of successes that felt contagious. If he could defeat English forces in small engagements, take key points, and show that English garrisons were not untouchable, then men who had submitted might begin to reconsider. Not out of sudden patriotism necessarily, but because the balance of risk would shift. Supporting Bruce would stop looking like suicide and start looking like the safer bet. One of the early, sharp moments of that year came at Loudun Hill in May 1307. Bruce faced an English force under Aymer de Valence, the same commander who had beaten him at Methven. The choice of ground was everything. Bruce, remembering what open ground had cost him, used terrain to cut down the effectiveness of English cavalry. The details vary in later telling, but the core idea is consistent. He positioned his men so that the English could not simply ride through them, forcing attacks into a narrowed approach where spears and discipline could do their work. Loudoun Hill did not end the war, but it did something just as important. It proved Bruce was learning, adapting, and becoming dangerous in a way that would not be easily corrected. It is hard to overstate how much psychology matters here. Scotland's nobles had watched Wallace rise and fall. They had watched Edward punish the country, watched leaders submit, watched the machinery of occupation return. Many were exhausted. They did not want another doomed flare of resistance that would bring more confiscations and executions. Bruce needed to show that he was not merely brave, but effective, that he could win without relying on miracles. While Bruce was climbing back from near ruin, another shift occurred that changed the whole strategic landscape. Edward I began his last campaign north. The old king was determined to crush Bruce personally. Edward's identity was bound up with conquest and authority. He did not like leaving problems unfinished. But Edward was no longer the Iron Man who had dominated earlier decades. Age and illness were catching him, and his final march carried a sense of grim urgency, as if he could feel time pressing at his back. Then, in July 1307, Edward I died at Berg by sands near Carlisle while on campaign. For Scotland, the significance was immediate. Edward's death did not magically free the country. English garrisons did not evaporate, and English armies did not vanish. But it removed a particular kind of force from the conflict: the personal will of a king who had made Scotland's submission a central project of his reign. Edward I had been relentless, skilled, and politically dominant. He combined administrative reach with military pressure in a way that was uniquely suffocating. With him gone, England's war in Scotland did not end, but it changed tone. The new king, Edward II, inherited not only the crown, but the burden of his father's unfinished conquest. Yet Edward II was not Edward I. Where the father had been a hammer, the son would prove far less consistent, more tangled in internal politics, more vulnerable to factional problems in England itself, and less able to give Scotland the singular attention his father had imposed. For Bruce, this was a breath of air. He did not waste it. He continued to fight the war he was best suited to fight. The war of wearing down occupation, not by a single confrontation, but by constant pressure. He attacked outposts, disrupted English movement, and began to rebuild the sense that Scotland could be governed by Scots. That last point mattered. A rebellion that only destroys can burn out. A rebellion that starts to govern becomes harder to uproot. In 1308, Bruce pushed deeper into the struggle against internal Scottish opposition, particularly the factions aligned against him, including remnants of the common power base. This was not a side conflict. It was central. Scotland could not unite against England if Scotland was still at war with itself. Bruce's kingship could not be secure if powerful rivals could use English support as leverage. So Bruce fought on two fronts, against English occupation and against Scottish resistance to his rule. These campaigns were brutal and politically charged. When Bruce moved into territories where the commons were strong, he was not merely fighting for land. He was reshaping the internal map of Scotland's power. Castles and lordships were not abstract on parchment. They were the levers by which men controlled regions. Taking them meant taking the ability to recruit, tax, and command. Somewhere inside this hard phase of consolidation is where Bruce's story intersects again with Wallace's shadow. Wallace had been the national symbol of refusal, the martyr whose death had been meant to end hope. Bruce could not resurrect Wallace, but he could use what Wallace represented: the idea that Scotland's dignity had been violated and demanded answer. The memory of Wallace's execution, still fresh in many minds, served as a kind of moral pressure. It reminded people that submission had not brought peace with honor. It had brought domination. For Bruce, that memory was fuel, but he had to turn fuel into structure. By 1309, Bruce's position had strengthened enough that he could hold a parliament at St. Andrews. This was more than a meeting. It was a statement that his kingship was becoming real in the administrative sense. Councils assembling, decisions recorded, the language of governance returning under Scottish authority. In a war of independence, paperwork can matter as much as battles because it signals legitimacy. It tells lords and clerics and foreign observers that this is not a band of fugitives. It is a kingdom trying to function. Still, the war remained far from won. English power held important castles and ports. Supplies and money were constant problems. Bruce's control was uneven, always threatened by the possibility of a renewed major English campaign. And within Scotland, not everyone was convinced. Some supported him out of loyalty, some out of fear, some because their interests aligned with his. Others remained hostile or cautious, waiting to see whether England would reassert itself decisively. But the direction had shifted. The conquest that had seemed permanent in 1305 now looked less secure. Bruce had survived the years when survival was unlikely. He had won enough to become credible. He had outlasted the old king, who had tried to crush him, and he had begun to rebuild a Scottish political center around his crown. In this sense, 1307 to 1309 was not the era of a single dramatic moment. It was the era of the slow turning of a wheel, the grinding shift from Bruce the fugitive to Bruce the king who might actually hold. It was the war learning a new rhythm, not a burst and collapse like Wallace's movement had been forced into, but a stubborn, strategic persistence meant to last long enough for England's attention to falter. And it was in that persistence that the next phase was born, one where Bruce would begin systematically tearing down English footholds, castle by castle, region by region, until England could no longer pretend it ruled Scotland simply because it said it did. The question now was not whether Bruce could survive. The question was whether England could stop him before he made survival into victory. By 1310, the war had changed into something colder and more methodical than the early blaze of Wallace's rising. The dream of a single, decisive moment had given way to a grinding truth. Scotland would be taken back, not in one stroke, but in pieces. Robert the Bruce had learned, through defeat, flight, and the slow rebuilding of his power, that English rule in Scotland was not a single enemy army you could smash. It was a network. Castles were the knots in that network. Roads and rivers were its veins. Officials, oaths, and garrisons were its daily heartbeat. If Bruce wanted a kingdom that could breathe again, he had to break that network one knot at a time. This period is sometimes called the Castle War, and it deserves that name because stone fortresses were not just military positions, they were political instruments. A castle meant an English sheriff could collect revenue from the surrounding district. It meant English soldiers could patrol the roads and punish communities. It meant English messengers could move with confidence. In a country like Scotland, large, rugged, and hard to control, castles did the work of armies even when armies were elsewhere. As long as the English held key fortresses, Scotland could never be fully free. It would always be a place where power could reappear overnight, riding out from a gatehouse with the authority of a foreign king. Bruce's solution was not simply to capture castles, it was often to erase them. He and his commanders increasingly practiced a hard strategy. Take a castle, remove its ability to be used again, and leave it unusable, burned, dismantled, its defenses slighted so that an English force could not return and instantly replant occupation in the same spot. This was not romantic warfare. It's practical and, in its own way, merciless. But it made sense. Bruce could not afford to garrison every stronghold he captured. He did not have the manpower to hold a castle on every hill. So he made the map itself less useful to his enemy. He turned English footholds into ruins, and in doing so, he reshaped the geography of the war. For the people living near those castles, the experience would have been complicated. A fortress might be a source of fear under English occupation, but it could also be a market, a place of employment, a node of order. However imposed, when it fell, that order fell too. Yet the alternative was worse. A Scotland permanently studded with foreign-held strongpoints, always vulnerable to renewed domination. Bruce's campaign demanded sacrifice in the short term to make long-term control possible. The English, for their part, were not blind to what was happening. But England, under Edward II, was not the same machine it had been under his father. The younger king's reign was beset by internal tensions, favoritism, and political fractures that absorbed energy. England might otherwise have poured into Scotland. That did not mean England was weak. It meant England was less coordinated, less relentless, less able to apply the same consistent pressure that Edward I had perfected. Bruce exploited that inconsistency like a crack in stone. Every time England hesitated, Bruce moved. Year by year, his control expanded. Sometimes it expanded through battles and raids. Sometimes it expanded through persuasion and calculation. Scottish nobles who had once opposed Bruce began to reconsider, as it became clear he was not fading. In medieval politics, success is a kind of argument. It convinces men who distrust you that betting against you may be riskier than making peace with you. Some came to Bruce willingly. Others were forced, their strongholds taken, their influence broken. In this way, Bruce's kingship hardened into something real, not universally loved, but increasingly unavoidable. In the north and west, Bruce and his allies worked to reduce English influence and suppress pockets of opposition. In the lowlands, they pressed on strategic points that mattered for movement and supply. English-held castles became increasingly isolated. A garrison can endure for a long time behind walls, but it cannot live without food, without relief, without the confidence that rescue will arrive. And as Bruce tightened pressure and disrupted lines of communication, the English footholds began to feel like islands surrounded by hostile land. This slow dismantling mattered because it set the stage for the war's next great hinge. The question of Stirling. Stirling Castle was not just another fortress. It was one of the most important strongholds in Scotland, commanding key routes and symbolizing control over the heart of the realm. If England held Stirling, Scotland's freedom would always feel provisional. If Scotland held Stirling, English occupation would be pushed back and fractured. Stirling wasn't only a prize, it was a statement. By 1313, attention increasingly turned toward it. Here is where the war becomes sharply focused again, not because Bruce suddenly wanted a single grand battle, but because the logic of castles forced a confrontation. A major fortress like Stirling could not easily be ignored. It had to be dealt with, and dealing with it created conditions that would eventually draw England into one of the most famous battles in its own medieval history. The campaign around Stirling involved one of the most fateful decisions of the war, an agreement made by the castle's commander. The English governor of Stirling Castle at this time was Sir Philip Mowbray. Facing Scottish pressure, and perhaps judging that relief might not come quickly, Mowbray entered into a bargain with Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce. The essence of the agreement, as remembered in accounts of the period, was this: if the castle was not relieved by England by a set date, often given as midsummer 1314, then Stirling would be surrendered to the Scots. It was a rational agreement in one sense. A commander wants clear terms and a chance for rescue. But it was also a political trap because it created a deadline that demanded a response from England. It forced Edward II's hand. If England failed to relieve Stirling, it would look like a confession of weakness. If England tried to relieve Stirling, it would have to send a major army into Scotland, and that army would have to march into terrain where Bruce could choose how to fight. In other words, the agreement made a great battle more likely. Bruce, when he learned of the bargain, is often portrayed as furious, or at least deeply concerned. The deadline meant the Scots could not simply wait and starve Stirling out at their own pace. It meant England could name the terms of the moment by deciding to come. Yet Bruce also understood that if England came, it would come along predictable routes. Its size would be vast. Its supply needs would be heavy. Its movement would be constrained by roads, rivers, and the need to bring cavalry and baggage. And if Bruce could force that army into a place where its strength could not unfold, Scotland might achieve what had once seemed impossible: a decisive victory against a royal English host. So the months that followed were not only about siege and pressure. They were about preparation, in the deepest sense: scouting, choosing ground, building defensive positions, training men, and strengthening the morale that must hold when an enemy arrives in overwhelming numbers. Bruce's army was still not England's equal in heavy cavalry, but it had hardened. It had fought for years. It had learned discipline through hardship. It had learned how to use spears not as individual weapons, but as a collective wall. And crucially, it had learned to trust Bruce's judgment in choosing when to fight and when not to. This period also sharpened Scotland's internal purpose. Wallace's rising had been a blaze of national anger and pride, briefly unified by victory, and then fractured by political realities and defeat. Bruce's war, slower and more controlled, had gradually shaped a different unity. Not perfect, not without rivalries, but anchored by the idea of a king who was actually present, actually fighting, and actually building something. Wallace's death had made him a martyr and a moral symbol. Bruce's survival was making him a ruler. In fact, the two together created a powerful story in Scottish memory. The man who proved resistance was possible, and the king who proved resistance could succeed. As 1313 drew toward its end, the pressure around Stirling became a drumbeat in the distance, steady, impossible to ignore. English garrisons elsewhere could still cause harm, but Stirling was now the key. The deadline hung over everything like a blade. Every Scottish success, every ruined castle, every shifting noble allegiance fed into the coming moment. England could not allow Stirling to fall without trying to stop it. Scotland could not afford to back away without losing the momentum it had spent years building. So both sides began to move, not yet onto the battlefield, but onto the path that led there. England would gather an army large enough to reassert dominance in one marching season. Edward II would come in person, because kingship demanded visibility, and because losing Stirling would be an embarrassment that would echo beyond Scotland. Scotland would choose where to meet that army, because Bruce understood what Wallace had understood at Stirling Bridge. When you are weaker in raw power, you must win the argument of terrain and timing. And somewhere, in the shadow of all this, the memory of Wallace still lingered, not as a commander now, but as a reminder of what English conquest looked like when it believed it had won. The cruelty of occupation, the humiliation of submission, the public violence meant to end hope. These were not distant stories. They were recent history. They were reasons. By the turn into 1314, the war had narrowed toward a single question that could no longer be postponed. Would England's king break Scotland's resurgence, or would Scotland's king break England's confidence? The next chapter moves into that gathering storm, the mustering of forces, the march toward Stirling, and the choice of ground at Bannockburn, where Scotland's long struggle would find its most famous day. By the spring of 1314, Scotland had reached the edge of a decision it could no longer avoid. For years, Robert the Bruce had fought with a patient kind of violence, breaking castles, dissolving English control piece by piece, refusing to gamble everything on one reckless day. That strategy had worked because it played to Scotland's strengths: local knowledge, mobility, and the ability to make occupation exhausting. But Stirling Castle changed the mathematics. It sat at the hinge of the realm, commanding movement between north and south, and its fate had been tied to a deadline through the bargain made between Philip Mowbray and Edward Bruce. If England did not relieve Stirling by the agreed date, it would fall, and England's already fraying claim to dominate Scotland would look like a lie spoken too loudly. So, England had to come. Edward II's decision to lead a major expedition into Scotland was not only military, it was political theater. A king could not afford to appear timid, especially not in a reign already troubled by internal faction and questions of competence. If Stirling fell without a fight, the humiliation would not stay in Scotland. It would echo through England's nobility, through foreign courts, through the stories that gather around kings like moss on stone. Edward II needed a show of strength. He needed, in the language of his father, to make Scotland remember who ruled. And so he gathered one of the largest armies to enter Scotland in generations, with banners and cavalry, infantry and archers, and the sprawling baggage train that always follows power when it expects to win. Bruce watched this gathering like a man listening to thunder beyond the hills. He knew England's army would be larger than his own. He knew it would include many knights eager for a crushing victory, and archers whose arrows could cut down dense formations the way they had at Falkirk. He also knew something else. A great army moves on predictable lines. It needs roads that can bear wagons, routes that can supply horses, crossings that can handle thousands. It cannot simply vanish into bog and wood the way a smaller force can. That predictability, if you have the courage to exploit it, becomes a leash. Bruce's problem was not whether England would come to Stirling. The problem was where, exactly, to meet it, and how to force it to fight in a way that made England's size a burden rather than an advantage. The landscape around Stirling offered possibilities. There were woods that could narrow approaches, marshy ground that could swallow horses, streams and burns that could break formation, and patches of higher ground where spearmen could anchor themselves. Bruce's experience had taught him that cavalry is terrifying only when it can gather speed and mass and strike a line that is already uncertain. If you deny a charge space, you deny it power. If you force horses into constrained lanes, you turn the finest knight into a man holding on to panic. There is a cold logic here that is easy to miss when people treat Bannockburn as a romantic miracle. Bruce did not win because Scotland was brave and England was cruel. Bruce won when he won, because he understood that bravery is useless unless it can be arranged into a situation where it matters. Scotland's weapon was not just the spear, it was the battlefield itself. As Edward II's army moved north, the psychological weight grew. Every mile was a reminder of England's resources. A great host in motion is not just soldiers, it is sound and scale. Metal, hooves, shouting, wagons, the constant churn of bodies and animals, banners lifting and snapping in the wind. It is the confidence of men who believe sheer mass will solve the problem. For Scots watching from the edges, it would have been both terrifying and infuriating. The old experience of occupation returning in moving form. Bruce's army was smaller, but it was not the raw gathering Wallace had once led. Years of war had trained it into something more cohesive. The core of Bruce's strength lay in disciplined infantry, spearmen organized into schiltrons, not necessarily static circles like the vulnerable masses at Falkirk, but units capable of holding ground, moving with purpose, and presenting a solid face to cavalry. These men were not professional soldiers in the later sense, but many had been fighting for years. They had endured retreats, raids, hunger, the constant pressure of garrisons. They had learned that survival often depended on standing firm when fear begged them to run. It is in this context that Bruce made one of his most defining choices: to stand and fight, near Bannockburn, south of Stirling, in a zone where woodland and wet ground could compress England's movements. By choosing this area, he signaled a willingness to risk everything, but it wasn't a gambler's risk. It was a calculated attempt to make England's arrival chaotic and constrained. To sharpen that constraint, Scottish preparations included measures to disrupt cavalry, such as pits and obstacles, often described in sources as pots or pots, small concealed hazards that could break a horse's legs, or at least force riders to slow and bunch up. Even if later telling has embellished the exact form, the idea is consistent with Bruce's overall approach. Channel the enemy, narrow them, make them come in badly. As the armies drew near, Stirling Castle remained like a stone eye watching. Mowbray, bound by the agreement, could not simply surrender early, and he could not pretend the deadline did not exist. Yet the agreement's existence gave Bruce something priceless: England's urgency. Edward II could not wander and delay. He had to push toward Stirling. Bruce could anticipate that push, prepare for it, and place his men where England's urgency would become impatience. And impatience in a medieval army is an ingredient for mistakes. When the English host approached the area, the situation became tense in a way that battle narratives often skip. There are always hours, sometimes days, where armies see each other, where scouts report movement, where commanders argue, where men sleep poorly and sharpen weapons and stare into distance. In these hours, morale is formed, fear can spread, confidence can harden, rumors can explode. For the Scots, the sight of Edward II's army would have been daunting, and Bruce's leadership in this moment was essential. He had to convince men that the ground would protect them, that their discipline would hold, that England's size was not the end of the story. For the English, there was confidence, but also a subtle danger in that confidence. Contempt. Many English nobles believed Scotland was a lesser place, its resistance a nuisance rather than a true war. That attitude can make men careless. It can make them eager to charge before plans are firm, eager to seize glory before the army is properly deployed. It can make them underestimate what a prepared enemy can do when fighting for its own soil. As the first day of contact approached, skirmishing and probing began, and the edges of the battlefield started to define themselves. This is where the narrative of Bannockburn often tightens toward one famous moment: Bruce's personal encounter with an English knight, traditionally identified as Henry de Bohun. The story goes that de Bohun, seeing Bruce on a smaller horse, rode at him with a lance, expecting an easy kill that would shatter Scottish morale in an instant. Bruce, at the last moment, is said to have sidestepped and struck the knight down with an axe, splitting helm and skull, winning not only the duel, but the psychological moment. Whether every detail of that encounter is exactly as later retelling shapes it, its persistence in the historical tradition is meaningful because it captures the kind of symbolic turning point battles often need. A king who fights like that becomes more than a commander. He becomes a proof. For Scottish soldiers who might have been trembling at the sight of England's mass, such a moment would be electric. It would say, "We are not here to be crushed. Our king will not hide behind a line. He will stand in the path of danger and survive it. And for England, such a moment, if witnessed and believed, could sting. It could turn confidence into irritation, and irritation into rashness. But Bannockburn was not going to be decided by a single duel. It would be decided by how armies moved in confined space, by how formations held under pressure, by whether archers could be used effectively, and by whether England's cavalry could find room to operate. In short, it would be decided by whether Bruce's chosen ground would do what he intended it to do. The night before the decisive fighting would have felt heavy on both sides. English campfires would have spread like a field of stars across the low ground, full of the noise of an army that believed it had come to finish the problem. Scottish fires, fewer and quieter, would have burned with a different emotion, a mix of dread and resolve, the calm that can come when choices have narrowed to one. Tomorrow, England would try to push through to Stirling and restore its dominance in a single march. Tomorrow, Scotland would try to turn that push into a trap. And tomorrow, the war that had lived in Wallace's shadow, through martyrdom, through years of castle breaking, through Bruce's desperate survival, would step into its most famous day, where the question would no longer be whether Scotland could resist, but whether it could win so convincingly that the world would have to take notice. The first thing to understand about Bannockburn is that it was not a single clash in a single afternoon. It unfolded across 2 days, with the first day shaping the second, and the second day finishing what the first had begun. It was a battle born from urgency. England's urgent need to relieve Stirling, Scotland's urgent need to make that relief impossible, and it was fought in a landscape that refused to behave like the wide, open fields English knights preferred. On June 23rd, 1314, the English host arrived close enough to begin forcing the issue. Edward II had brought an army that, by medieval standards, was massive. Its strength lay in numbers, cavalry, and the confidence that comes with believing your opponent is smaller, poorer, and bound to break. But that confidence met an enemy who had not chosen to stand on open ground. Bruce had anchored his army in a zone of woods, burns, and soft land that narrowed movement and turned a rush of horsemen into a slow, bunched pressure. The English advance that day was not an orderly unveiling of a perfect plan. It was a series of movements and reactions shaped by the same thing that always shapes medieval battles: the hunger for position and the hunger for personal glory. Knights saw opportunities. Commanders tried to coordinate. Scouts brought news that changed decisions. The front of the army pressed forward while the rear still struggled with the realities of moving thousands of men, horses, and wagons. The battlefield began to fill with the friction of too much mass in too little space. It was in this pressure that the famous encounter involving Robert the Bruce occurred. An English knight, often identified in accounts as Henry de Bohun, saw Bruce ahead and apparently recognized the chance of a lifetime. Kill the Scottish king, and the battle might end before it truly begins. A lance charge against a king could be more than a tactical strike. It could be a psychological collapse, a sudden draining of courage from men who had been holding themselves together by faith in their leader. So, the knight rode at Bruce, and Bruce did not flee. The story preserved by tradition has him waiting until the last instant, then shifting his mount aside and bringing his axe down, killing the knight in one decisive blow. Some details may have been sharpened by retelling, as heroic moments often are, but the core meaning of the episode fits the realities of the battlefield. It was the kind of moment that can reverberate through an army like lightning. For the Scots, it would have been a surge of confidence. Our king does not hide. Our king stands. For the English, it could only have been a sting, an early sign that the expected easy victory might not be so easy. The first day also saw other clashes as the English attempted to probe and push into Scottish positions. These were not the final contest of the battle, but they mattered because they forced England to commit to the cramped approaches Bruce had prepared. Every charge that failed to break Scottish lines, every shove that ended in confusion, taught England something unpleasant. Its usual weapons were not finding their full power here. By the time evening came, the English had not achieved what they needed. Stirling had not been relieved. The Scots had not broken. Instead, England's army found itself camped in a dangerous position, crowded into ground that limited movement, facing an enemy that seemed unusually stable. The sheer size of Edward's host became a problem. Men and horses needed space. They needed order. They needed confidence that tomorrow they could deploy properly. Instead, they were pressed and uneasy, forced to sleep with the sense that the battlefield itself was against them. For the Scots, the night carried a different emotion. They were still outnumbered, and they knew it. But they had held. They had proved that English cavalry could be resisted, and that the terrain could do some of the work they had asked it to do. They would have known, too, that tomorrow could still bring disaster. A single failure, one schiltron breaking, one moment of panic, could unravel everything. Yet they also had something they did not always have in wars against wealthier kingdoms: a plan that was working. The second day, 24th June, is where Bannockburn becomes the Bannockburn remembered. At dawn, the Scots moved with intention, advancing from their positions with their spear formations organized and steady. This movement is important. It wasn't just passive defense. Bruce was not simply waiting to be hit. He was pushing his army forward in a controlled way, presenting the English with a wall that did not merely endure, but pressed. To an English knight, a Scottish schiltron advancing would have been unnerving. The traditional image of a schiltron is a static hedge, a thing you try to break. But an advancing schiltron is something else entirely, a disciplined mass that denies cavalry space while actively taking ground. It says, you cannot simply circle and pick the moment. We are forcing the moment on you. As the Scots advanced, the English attempted to organize, but organization is a delicate thing when you have too many bodies and too little room. English cavalry, which should have been able to maneuver, found itself compressed. The line behind pressed forward. The space that might have allowed knights to build speed and strike the Scottish formations cleanly was reduced by the ground and by the crowding of England's own force. At the same time, the English infantry and archers, tools that could have changed the battle, struggled to be deployed effectively in a way that could break the Scottish formations. Archers are deadly when they have clear lanes of fire and protection against counterattack. At Falkirk, English archers had been able to shoot into packed Scottish formations with devastating effect. At Bannockburn, the terrain and the flow of the battle made that much harder if archers could not be placed properly. If they could not shoot without being disrupted, then one of England's greatest advantages would be muffled. In the confusion, English attempts to bring archers to bear were contested, and the Scots used the opportunities the terrain and the moment offered. Whether through cavalry of their own, through light troops, or through sheer pressure, the Scots prevented the archers from deciding the day the way they had at Falkirk. What mattered most was that England never achieved the clean, coordinated use of arms it needed. Cavalry and archers and infantry were not functioning as a single machine. They were functioning as parts that kept jamming against the constraints of the battlefield and the push of the Scottish advance. As the pressure increased, the English line began to fray. Men pushed against each other. Horses panicked. Knights, who expected to be the hammer, began to feel like they were trapped inside a crowd they could not control. The Scots, fighting in tight formations, benefited from the simple advantage of discipline under compression. In a crush, an army that can hold a coherent face and keep pressing has a terrible power. It turns the enemy's mass into suffocation. At some point in the battle, the English position began to collapse, not necessarily all at once, but in the way collapses often happen. First, a sense of confusion, then a local retreat, then a widening sense that retreat is spreading, then panic. When medieval armies panic, the slaughter can be catastrophic because flight is more dangerous than fighting. Men are cut down from behind. Horses trample the fallen. The river and the bog become weapons. And as the English tried to withdraw from ground that was already crowded and constrained, the retreat turned into chaos. Edward II himself was in real danger. The battle was not simply a defeat in the abstract. It was a breakdown close enough to threaten the king. His survival depended on being escorted away, pulled back from the collapsing field, and guided toward safety. A king fleeing is a powerful image in medieval politics because kings are supposed to be the stable center of their armies. When the king runs, the story of the battle writes itself. England's defeat at Bannockburn was devastating, not only in casualties, but in humiliation. It failed to relieve Stirling. It failed to crush Bruce. It failed in the kind of way that makes future claims of dominance harder to sustain. Soon after, Stirling Castle surrendered under the terms of the earlier agreement, and Scotland gained one of the most important strongholds in the kingdom. But the deeper consequence was psychological. Bannockburn did to English confidence what Stirling Bridge had begun to do years earlier. It proved that Scotland's resistance could win even when England brought a king and a great host. It proved that Bruce was not merely surviving. He was capable of engineering a battlefield where England's advantages could be neutralized. It proved, for Scottish nobles who still hesitated, that supporting Bruce was not a doomed cause. And it did something even larger. It changed how the world could view Scotland's struggle. Foreign courts might still hesitate to offend England, but they could no longer pretend the Scottish king was a minor insurgent. He had defeated the English king in the field. That fact carries its own kind of legitimacy. In the years immediately after Bannockburn, Scotland was not instantly secure. England still held resources. English politics still mattered. The war would continue, shifting into new forms: raids, diplomacy, attempts to force recognition. But Bannockburn made a different future imaginable. It moved the war from the question of whether Scotland could resist to the question of whether England could accept the reality that Scotland would not submit. And hovering behind that transformation was the memory of Wallace. Wallace had died as a symbol of refusal. His execution had been meant to erase the cause. Bannockburn, less than a decade later, proved that the cause had not only survived, it had matured. The resistance had found a king who could translate defiance into lasting power. The battle did not finish the story. It opened the door to the story's next phase: the long struggle to turn victory into recognition, to force England and Europe to acknowledge what had been won on the muddy ground near a small burn. Because winning in battle is one thing, being recognized as free is another. Bannockburn did not end the war. It changed the terms under which the war was fought. Before June 1314, Scotland's struggle could still be treated by England as a stubborn rebellion led by a crowned troublemaker whose defeat was only a matter of proper effort. After Bannockburn, that story was harder to sustain. Robert the Bruce had beaten the English king in the field and forced the surrender of Stirling. The victory made Bruce's kingship feel less like a claim and more like a fact. It made Scottish morale surge and English confidence wobble. But it also created a new problem, one that often follows great victories. How do you turn a battlefield result into a political reality that lasts? Scotland had learned a bitter lesson in the years of Wallace. A single victory, even a spectacular one, could be answered with another army, another campaign, another season of pressure. Bannockburn had broken England's immediate attempt to crush Bruce, but England was still larger, richer, and capable of returning. If Scotland simply sat behind its borders and waited, England might recover its organization and try again when the time felt right. Bruce needed to keep England off balance. He needed to make the war expensive for the English crown and painful for English communities, so that continuing the conquest would become politically toxic. So, the war moved south again. In the months after Bannockburn, Scottish forces carried out raids into northern England. These were not mindless rampages in the way propaganda sometimes paints them, though like most medieval raids, they could be brutal and destructive. They were a strategic tool. By attacking across the border, Bruce forced England to confront insecurity on its own soil. English lords in the north, once eager for Scottish submission, now had to defend their own lands and pressure their own king for protection. The more Scotland could keep northern England anxious, the more England's internal politics would weaken its ability to focus on reconquering Scotland. Raiding also served an economic purpose. War consumed supplies. Scotland, poorer than England, needed food, animals, and money. Northern England could provide those through plunder, ransom, and forced contributions. This is one of the uncomfortable truths in telling this history accurately. Independence wars are not fought only with idealism. They are fought with logistics. Armies march on grain and cattle as surely as they march on courage. English responses to the raids were uneven. The shock of Bannockburn had not only wounded Edward II's prestige, it had exposed the divisions and difficulties inside his reign. English politics at the time were strained by rivalry among nobles and by resentment over royal favoritism. Those internal strains mattered directly to Scotland because they limited England's ability to mount consistent campaigns north. When a kingdom cannot agree on strategy, it tends to fight in bursts, angry, expensive bursts, rather than sustained pressure. Bruce's aim was to keep England trapped in that pattern. At the same time, Bruce also sought to secure Scotland internally. After Bannockburn, some Scottish nobles who had been hesitant or opposed were forced to choose again. Some submitted to Bruce, accepting that his kingship was now the most realistic path forward. Others were dispossessed. Bruce redistributed lands and rewarded loyal supporters, strengthening the foundations of his regime. This was not simply greed or revenge. It was statecraft. In medieval politics, loyalty is often built with land. If Bruce wanted a stable Scotland, he needed a stable base of men whose fortunes were tied to his success. Yet, for all the strength Bannockburn gave him, Bruce still faced a problem that victory alone could not solve: international recognition. England could continue to call him a rebel. The papacy mattered because church approval could legitimize kings or isolate them. France mattered because it could offer diplomatic leverage. Other powers mattered because Scotland needed to be seen as a real kingdom with a real king, not merely as a war zone. Bruce's solution to this was twofold. He pursued diplomacy where he could, and he pursued pressure where diplomacy stalled. He would make it difficult for England to pretend Scotland was simply an internal problem. The war had to become something England could not quietly ignore. This brings us to one of the boldest and most controversial extensions of the conflict: the attempt to open a second front through Ireland. Ireland mattered for several reasons. It was geographically close, accessible by sea routes that Scots in the west understood well. It was also politically connected to England, which held authority there through a patchwork of lords and institutions. If Scotland could destabilize English power in Ireland, or, more ambitiously, if Scotland could place a friendly king there, it could force England into a multi-front struggle and create new possibilities for alliances and supply. In 1315, Bruce's brother, Edward Bruce, led an invasion of Ireland. The campaign was framed in part as liberation for the Irish from English domination, and it did attract some Irish support, particularly among Gaelic lords who resented English influence. But Ireland's political landscape was complex, and not all Irish factions welcomed the Scots. The invasion became a long, difficult struggle marked by battles, shifting alliances, and hardship, made worse by famine conditions that affected parts of the region and turned war into a deeper human catastrophe. In 1316, Edward Bruce was crowned High King of Ireland by his supporters, a remarkable moment that shows how far the Scottish leadership was willing to push its strategy. If successful, it could have created a Gaelic-aligned bloc against England, but success required resources Scotland could barely spare, and it required stability in Ireland that the realities of war and politics did not provide. The campaign dragged on, costly and uncertain, even as Bruce continued to fight the main war against England. Meanwhile, the border war continued. Scottish raids reached deep enough at times to alarm English communities far from the frontier. English lords were forced into defensive postures. The northern counties, already economically vulnerable, suffered. This, in turn, created domestic pressure on Edward II, who was criticized for failing to protect his realm. The war was no longer a proud attempt at conquest. It was becoming a bleeding problem. But England did not stop trying. There were attempts to negotiate, attempts to regroup, attempts to find moments when Scotland could be forced back. Sometimes there were truces, temporary pauses, diplomatic exchanges. Yet neither side could fully step away. Scotland needed recognition. England needed to avoid admitting defeat. By 1318, the Irish venture reached a grim climax. Edward Bruce was killed at the Battle of Falkirk. With his death, Scotland's effort to secure Ireland under a Bruce kingship collapsed. The campaign had drained resources and caused immense suffering, and although it had distracted England and opened possibilities, it ultimately failed in its most ambitious aim. Scotland lost a key leader, and Bruce lost his brother. An emotional and strategic blow. Yet even in that loss, Bruce's position in Scotland remained strong. Bannockburn had not been undone. Scottish control over much of the kingdom had expanded. English garrisons were fewer and more isolated. Scotland's political life, parliaments, governance, the distribution of lands, had been reasserted under Bruce's kingship. And still, the central question remained unresolved. Would England recognize what had become reality on the ground? The years after 1318 would intensify the struggle for that recognition. Bruce would continue to apply pressure through raids and diplomacy. Scotland would continue to define itself not merely as not England, but as a kingdom that insisted on being treated as a kingdom. The war would become as much a contest of legitimacy as of swords, a battle over whose story would be accepted by Europe. And out of that struggle would come one of the most famous documents in Scottish history, a declaration designed to speak not only to kings, but to the conscience of Christendom, the Declaration of Arbroath. That document, and the crisis that produced it, belong to the next chapter. After Bannockburn and the years of raids that followed, Scotland's war began to look less like a series of battles and more like a struggle over legitimacy. Robert the Bruce had fought England in the field and survived. He had taken castles, secured much of his realm, and built a kingship that functioned in practice. Yet England still refused to recognize him as king. To England, he was an upstart and a usurper. To many in Europe, Scotland remained a problem to be managed, a dispute between rulers, a quarrel at the edge of Christendom that could be ignored unless it threatened wider stability. But to the Scots who had lived through occupation, it was not a quarrel. It was a question of whether their kingdom would continue to exist. The tension around this question pressed sharply in 1319. England tried again to assert itself. One of the most dramatic episodes was the attempt to retake Berwick, a key border town and port with enormous strategic importance. Control of Berwick mattered because it was a gateway for trade and invasion alike. When Scotland held it, England's northern frontier felt exposed. When England held it, Scotland felt constantly threatened. Bruce's forces pressed the siege, and England responded with an expedition that included an attempt to relieve pressure by drawing Scottish forces away. An attack that culminated in the Battle of Myton, sometimes remembered as the Chapter of Myton, because of the heavy involvement of clergy and local levies on the English side. The details of that battle can blur in the popular memory, but its meaning is clearer. England was struggling to coordinate effective responses, and Scotland could still strike with enough force to embarrass English mobilization. At the same time, Bruce's government faced pressures that were not purely military. The papacy mattered enormously in medieval politics. A pope could excommunicate kings, demand obedience, and serve as a moral authority recognized across Europe. Bruce's position with the church had long been complicated by the murder of John Comyn in a church in 1306. Even after years of war, that act hung over Bruce like a shadow, giving England a spiritual argument as well as a political one. Bruce was not only rebellious, he was stained. This mattered because legitimacy in the medieval world was not merely about who held land. It was about recognition by nobles, by foreign courts, and by the church. If the papacy refused to acknowledge Bruce, or if it treated Scotland as a rebellious province, Scotland's diplomatic position would remain weak no matter how many English raids it survived. The Scottish response to this problem was brilliant in a way that reveals how mature their political thinking had become since the days of Wallace. They did not only fight, they argued. They wrote their case into the language of European authority. In April 1320, a letter was produced at Arbroath Abbey, addressed to Pope John XXII. It is known today as the Declaration of Arbroath. It was not signed by Bruce himself. That is one of its key features. Instead, it was presented as the voice of the Scottish community of the realm, its leading nobles and barons, speaking as representatives of the kingdom. The document's purpose was clear: to persuade the Pope to recognize Scotland's independence and to pressure England to cease its claims. What makes the declaration so powerful is not only its historical importance, but its tone. It does not beg, it asserts. It frames the conflict not as a personal dispute between kings, but as a matter of a people defending their freedom. It also places Bruce's kingship within that framework. Bruce is king because he defends Scotland. If he ceased to do so, the implication is that he would not deserve to remain king. This was a sophisticated political maneuver. It told the Pope, Scotland is not a rebellious province. It is an ancient kingdom. Its people have chosen to resist domination. And it is not merely Bruce's ambition that drives this war. It is the realm's collective will to remain free. The declaration also reaches for history and identity. It speaks of Scotland's ancient origins and long independence, crafting a narrative that Scotland is not a new invention, but a rightful and enduring polity. In medieval diplomacy, these claims mattered. Nations justified themselves through lineage, antiquity, and continuity. The Scots were saying, in effect, that their kingdom was as legitimate as any in Europe. Perhaps the most famous element of the Declaration is its argument about freedom. It insists that the Scots fight not for glory or wealth, but for liberty, which no good man surrenders, except with his life. That line has echoed across centuries, because it compresses the emotional truth of the struggle into a moral statement. It turned a war into something that could be understood beyond Scotland's borders, not merely a feud, but a defense of a people's right to govern themselves. But the Declaration's force is not simply rhetorical. It is backed by a hard implication. Scotland will not submit, regardless of what England demands. The nobles signing it were binding themselves, at least in principle, to a continued refusal. It also warned the Pope, indirectly, that peace would not be achieved by telling Scotland to obey England, because Scotland rejected England's claim at the deepest level. In addition, the Declaration subtly reframed Bruce's image. If the Pope's hesitation was tied to Bruce's past sins, the Declaration's strategy was to place him within a narrative of national necessity. Bruce is not portrayed as a man who seized power for personal gain. He is portrayed as a protector, chosen because he is capable of leading the defense of the realm. That does not erase the common murder, but it changes the story around it. Bruce's kingship becomes a practical and moral instrument for Scotland's survival. The document's timing was no accident. Scotland was not writing philosophy in a quiet library. Scotland was writing under pressure, in a moment when England still refused to yield, and the papacy still held uncertain authority over international recognition. The Declaration was a weapon, but a diplomatic one. It was meant to make it harder for the Pope to treat Scotland as a mere English problem. It was meant to force the idea of Scottish independence into the moral framework of Christendom. Did it work instantly? Not in a simple way. Medieval diplomacy rarely produces immediate flips. The papacy had its own interests and pressures. England was still powerful. The Pope could not easily alienate a major kingdom. But documents like this matter because they shift the terms of debate. They build the moral case. They offer the story that later treaties can accept, and they also reveal something important about Scotland. By 1320, Scotland's struggle had evolved from the desperate heroism of Wallace's rising into a mature political movement capable of presenting itself as a legitimate kingdom. Wallace had shown the world that Scotland would resist. Bruce's government was now trying to prove to the world that Scotland deserved to be recognized as free. There is another layer to the Declaration that ties back to Wallace's story in a quieter way. Wallace's execution had been a public act meant to redefine him as a traitor. The Declaration, by asserting Scotland's independence and the righteousness of resistance, implicitly rejected the logic that had made Wallace treasonous. If Scotland was a sovereign kingdom, then Wallace had not been a traitor to England. He had been a defender of his own realm. In this way, the Declaration is not only a legal argument, it is a reclaiming of meaning. It restores the moral frame in which resistance makes sense. The declaration of a kingdom's right to freedom is not the same as securing that freedom. After 1320, the war still continued. England still refused to accept Bruce as king. There were still raids, negotiations, and shifting political storms. But the Declaration of Arbroath stands as a moment when Scotland spoke in a voice meant for Europe, not just for the battlefield. It said, in the clearest terms Scotland could craft, "We are not fighting for a man. We are fighting for the existence of our nation." And when a war becomes that, it becomes very difficult to end it by force alone. The next chapter moves from argument back into pressure. The continued campaigns, the exhaustion spreading in England, and the slow approach toward a settlement that would finally acknowledge what Scotland had insisted on all along. After the declaration of Arbroath, the war did not suddenly soften. If anything, the years that followed carried a sharper edge, because Scotland had now nailed its argument to the door of Europe and dared anyone to deny it. Robert the Bruce and his supporters were no longer just surviving. They were insisting on recognition. And when recognition does not come through words, kingdoms try to force it through cost. The early 1320s were defined by a strange double movement. In Scotland, Bruce's regime grew steadier and more confident, even as the kingdom remained scarred and strained by years of fighting. In England, Edward II's authority weakened under the pressure of internal conflict, noble resentment, and the humiliations the Scottish War kept bringing to the north. The borderlands became a place of recurring dread, an open wound that never had time to close, because Scottish raids continued to remind English communities that the war had crossed a line from conquest into punishment. By 1321 and 1322, England's internal troubles were deepening. Edward II's reign was dominated by factional struggle, powerful barons who believed the king was misgoverned, resentments over royal favorites, and competing visions of what the crown should be. For Scotland, this mattered as much as any battle. A kingdom divided against itself struggles to sustain an external war. Even if England could still field armies, its capacity to do so consistently and with unity of purpose was compromised. Bruce understood how to use that. Scottish strategy in these years remained centered on pressure. The Scots could not compel England to recognize Scottish independence by merely defending their own territory. England could always claim, at least in theory, that Scotland was a rebellious province, and that time would bring Scotland back to obedience. Bruce had to make the war feel unbearable, not just to the king, but to the English political class and the English North. He had to create a situation where English nobles began to see continued war as harmful to their own interests, and where the crown's inability to end the problem became a source of embarrassment and instability. So the raids continued, and they were systematic in their effect. A raid is not simply a fight. It is economic violence. It disrupts harvests, empties barns, seizes livestock, takes hostages, and forces payments. It makes security expensive. It makes local elites look weak. It generates anger that is often aimed not only at the raiders, but at the ruler who cannot stop them. In this way, raids can corrode legitimacy, which was exactly what Bruce needed in England. He did not necessarily need to destroy England's armies. He needed to undermine England's willingness to keep paying for this war. England did attempt to respond militarily. In 1322, Edward II mounted a campaign into Scotland. On paper, it looked like England's return to authority, the king marching north, banners raised, knights and infantry gathered. But Scotland under Bruce had become skilled at refusing battle on the enemy's terms. Instead of meeting Edward in a single-pitched confrontation, the Scots pulled back, removed supplies, and made the English march into a landscape that offered hunger and frustration. rather than decisive victory. The deeper England marched, the more stretched its logistics became. A medieval army cannot live on courage alone. It needs grain, fodder, and stable routes. Bruce's Scotland was becoming a place where those essentials were deliberately denied. The campaign ended without the crushing result Edward needed. England returned home having spent money, endured hardship, and failed to reassert dominance. The pattern was repeating. England could come north and burn and march, but it could not permanently fix the problem. Scotland remained defiant, and Bruce remained king. Meanwhile, Scotland pushed its own advantage. The Scots struck not only through raids, but by tightening control over remaining English positions and ensuring that Scottish governance continued to function. Bruce's authority wasn't built solely on battlefield success. It was built on the ability to distribute land, enforce decisions, and maintain the sense that Scotland was not a temporary uprising, but a state. Still, even as Scotland became stronger in practice, the war's human toll never disappeared. Years of violence leave a country exhausted. Fields go untilled. Families lose men. Trade suffers. Communities that have been raided repeatedly learn to fear hoofbeats and smoke in the distance. Scotland could not afford endless war any more than England could, but Scotland had one advantage. The war was being fought over Scotland's existence. For Scotland, the stakes were absolute. For England, the stakes were pride, ambition, and legacy. Serious, but ultimately negotiable if the cost became too high. And the cost was becoming too high. By the middle of the decade, England's internal crisis reached a breaking point. Edward II's political weakness became catastrophic, and the center of English power shifted. The Queen, Isabella, and her ally, Roger Mortimer, would play a key role in the upheaval that followed, leading to Edward's deposition and the rise of the young Edward III. For Scotland, this turmoil in England created both opportunity and risk. Opportunity, because a divided England might be more willing to negotiate. Risk, because new regimes sometimes seek dramatic victories to establish legitimacy, and Scotland could be used as a stage for that. Yet what England needed most in those years was stability, and Scotland was not offering it for free. Bruce pressed further into the logic of forcing peace through pressure. Scottish forces and allied leaders continued to bring the war south, and England's north continued to suffer. The border counties, already battered, became the place where England's frustration concentrated. Local leaders demanded protection. The Crown struggled to provide it. Each failure made England look less in control. Then, in 1327, something shifted that mattered deeply for the balance of the war. Bruce's forces achieved a major success at Stanhope Park, where an English campaign was harried and humiliated. The Scots avoided a conventional battle and instead used night attacks and disruption to undermine English confidence. The effect was not only military, it was psychological. It reinforced the sense that even when England tried to return in force, Scotland could still outmaneuver it and make the campaign miserable. By this stage, the path toward negotiation was opening, not because England suddenly respected Scotland's argument, but because England was tired and unstable. The costs were rising, the results were not improving, and Scotland's position under Bruce was now strong enough that continued denial looked increasingly detached from reality. There is also a deeper truth at work in why peace became possible. The war was no longer simply about Bruce's personality. Scotland's resistance had hardened into a national political fact. Even if Bruce died, the structures he had built, the loyalties forged by land grants, the institutions that had re-emerged, the identity sharpened by years of struggle, would not evaporate easily. England could continue trying to force control, but it would be forcing control over a country that had already learned to live in defiance. Negotiations in medieval politics are rarely clean or purely principled. They are bargains shaped by exhaustion, leverage, and the shifting needs of rulers. For Bruce, the goal was clear: formal recognition of Scotland's independence and of his kingship, so the war could end in a way that secured the future rather than simply pausing violence until the next English king tried again. For England, the goal was to stabilize its own realm and end a costly conflict that was not delivering victory without appearing too humiliating to the political class. This tension produced the settlement of 1328, the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton. The treaty's core meaning was immense. England recognized Scotland as an independent kingdom and recognized Robert the Bruce as its king. The terms addressed borders, claims, and the need to restore a formal relationship between the two realms that did not depend on England's overlordship. For Scotland, it was the kind of recognition that made Bannockburn and Arbroath feel complete. Victory turned into legitimacy. But no treaty exists in a vacuum. The agreement required political acts to reinforce it, including marriage alliances meant to bind the peace and make it harder to undo. Bruce's son and heir, David, would be married into the English royal line, an attempt to weave peace into blood, as medieval diplomacy often tried to do. Yet, even as the treaty was signed, it carried a quiet fragility. England had recognized Scottish independence, but recognition does not erase resentment. Many English nobles viewed the settlement as humiliating. Some would later call it shameful. Treaties made under political weakness are often treated as temporary once political strength returns. Scotland had won recognition, but it would still have to defend that recognition in the years to come. And Bruce himself, by 1328, was a man nearing the end of his life. The years of war had taken their toll. He had carried Scotland through the hardest phase of its struggle, from a crown claimed in desperation to a kingdom recognized by treaty. But the future would now belong to a new generation, a child king, nobles who would test their power, and an England that might someday decide it wanted to rewrite the agreement. Still, for the moment, Scotland had what Wallace had never lived to see, and what Bruce had nearly died trying to build: a recognized, independent kingdom, standing not as a rebellious province, but as a nation acknowledged in Europe's diplomatic language. And this is where Wallace's story and Bruce's story intersect again in meaning. Wallace had resisted when resistance looked hopeless. His death had been meant to teach Scotland fear. Instead, it became part of the moral foundation for continued defiance. Bruce took that defiance and built strategy around it, castle by castle, campaign by campaign, until defiance became a settlement signed in ink. The war had begun with occupation and submission. It now ended, at least on paper, with recognition, but the ending of a war is not the ending of a story. Because the people who carry a kingdom forward, the heirs, the nobles, the rival claimants, inherit not only peace, but the unresolved tensions beneath it. Scotland was free, but it was fragile. England had agreed, but it had not forgotten. And Bruce, who had lived long enough to win, now faced the most human of all conclusions: the question of whether his victory could outlive him. The next chapter moves into Bruce's final years, his failing health, his effort to secure the succession, and the last gestures of a king who understood that even after treaties, a nation's future can still be taken away if it is not guarded. The Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton brought Scotland something it had chased through decades of blood: recognition. Ink on parchment could never heal every wound the war had opened, but it changed the nature of the struggle. Scotland was no longer fighting merely to prove it could resist. It had compelled England to say, in the language of kings and courts, that Scotland was a kingdom, and Robert the Bruce was its rightful ruler. For Robert the Bruce, this moment was both triumph and ending. He'd spent most of his adult life in motion, riding hard through rain and smoke, sleeping in uncertainty, learning to measure time by campaigns and seasons. He had lived with the constant pressure of capture and betrayal, of sudden ruin, of knowing that one failed battle could collapse everything he had tried to build. Now, at last, he had what he wanted on paper. Yet, his body was failing. The war had taken its toll, and the years had left him with a kind of fatigue that even victory could not lift. The chronicles speak of illness in his final years. Later traditions argue over what it was. What matters for the story is simple and human. He was not a healthy man, enjoying a long peace. He was a king, racing his own decline, trying to secure a future that might not wait for him. Peace, when it comes after long war, is never just relief. It is a new set of dangers. During war, you can explain hardship through necessity. You can hold men together by reminding them of the enemy. In peace, internal rivalries return to the surface, and ambition looks for opportunity. Scotland had been held in a fierce unity by the pressure of England. Now that the pressure eased, Scotland had to learn how to be a kingdom again, how to govern, how to tax, how to settle disputes, without the constant excuse of emergency. Bruce understood this. He had spent years not only fighting, but building a political base, distributing lands, rewarding loyal supporters, binding powerful men to his success. But loyalty in the medieval world is not a gentle feeling. It is a balance of advantage, honor, fear, and obligation. If a king grows weak, men start to measure what they might gain by shifting. If a king dies leaving a child heir, the measuring becomes sharper. Bruce's heir was his son, David. David was still a child in 1328 and 1329, far too young to command an army or intimidate a council of ambitious nobles. This was one of the deep vulnerabilities of medieval monarchy. A kingdom could be stable under a strong adult ruler and suddenly fragile under a child, not because the child is at fault, but because power attracts men who want to hold it in the child's name. So, Bruce's last years were filled with the work of securing succession. He needed the realm to accept David as the legitimate King of Scots after him. He he needed the political class to be invested in that succession. He needed alliances strong enough to discourage opportunists and policies firm enough to keep the peace from collapsing the moment the king's breath stopped. One of the key tools for securing peace was marriage, binding kingdoms with blood. Under the terms of the settlement, David was married to Joan, the sister of Edward III of England. The symbolism was clear. Peace would not only be a treaty, it would be a family bond. In medieval diplomacy, this was a common tactic, but it was never a guarantee. Family ties could be used to prevent war, or they could become excuses for war if claims and grievances shifted later. Still, for Bruce, it was a practical step. It tied Scotland's future king to England's royal house in a way that made renewed conquest more politically complicated. Yet Bruce would not have been naive about England's mood. Many English nobles despised the treaty. They saw it as humiliation, forced by weakness and disorder. They remembered Bannockburn not as a lesson in restraint, but as a wound. They might tolerate peace while England stabilized, but tolerance can turn into revenge when strength returns. Bruce knew that Scotland's recognition might be challenged again. That is why he needed Scotland internally unified enough to withstand future pressure. There's another aspect of Bruce's final years that adds a strange, almost spiritual texture to the story. The sense that he wanted to complete something beyond politics. Medieval kings lived in a world where salvation mattered, where sin and redemption were not metaphors, but realities that shaped how people saw their lives. Bruce carried the stain of Common's murder and the violence of years of war. He had sought papal favor and worked toward reconciliation with the church. Even if politics demanded it, he would have felt the weight of what he had done. In this context, Bruce's reported desire to take part in a crusade, or at least to have his heart carried on crusade after his death, makes sense. Crusading was, for many knights and kings, a way to frame one's life within a religious narrative of service and redemption. Whether Bruce's wish was purely spiritual or also a matter of reputation, it reveals how medieval leaders thought. A king did not only want to win, he wanted to be remembered in a way that fit the moral language of his time. But all of these plans, alliances, succession arrangements, spiritual gestures, were pressed against one simple fact. His time was short. In 1329, Robert the Bruce died. The end came not in battle, but in illness, after he had achieved what Wallace had died trying to begin, a Scotland recognized as a kingdom with its own king. Bruce's death was not the end of Scotland's struggle, far from it, but it was the end of the first great arc of that struggle, the arc that turned occupation into resistance, resistance into kingship, and kingship into recognition. For Scotland, the moment was precarious. A child would inherit the crown. England, now under a new and energetic king, Edward III, would grow in strength and confidence in the years ahead. The treaty existed, but treaties can be broken. Scotland's freedom had been won, but it would still need to be protected, not only from England, but from the ambitions and rivalries inside Scotland itself. And when a child king sits on a throne, rival claimants begin to dream. This is where the shadow of John Balliol returns, because although Balliol had been deposed long ago, his claim had not entirely vanished. Men who had lost lands under Bruce men who resented Bruce's rise, and men who wanted to restore their fortunes could rally around an alternative. In the years ahead, those forces would gather behind Edward Balliol, John Balliol's son, creating a new crisis that would test whether Scotland's independence was truly secure. In this sense, Bruce's death closes one chapter of the larger national story and opens another. Wallace's martyrdom had fueled resistance. Bruce's victories had secured recognition. Now the question became, could Scotland hold what it had gained when the strong king was gone? Wallace's story, in popular imagination, ends at the scaffold. But history does something stranger. It keeps using the name. It keeps returning to the symbol whenever Scotland needs a memory strong enough to push against fear. In the coming struggle, when Scotland would again be threatened by invasion and internal division, the idea of Wallace as the pure voice of refusal would remain powerful because it reminded people what submission to England had once meant and could mean again. Bruce's last years, then, are a quiet kind of hinge. The war ends on paper. The king dies. The future becomes uncertain again, as if Scotland must prove its right to exist not once, but repeatedly, each time a new generation rises. The next chapter moves into that uncertainty. The reign of the child King David II, the return of English-backed claimants, and the way Scotland's independence, won so hard, was challenged again almost immediately. When Robert the Bruce died in 1329, Scotland inherited peace, the way a child inherits a heavy cloak, too large, too weighty, and easy for others to grab at. The treaty with England still existed on parchment, but the man whose will and reputation had forced England to sign it was gone. In his place sat a boy, David II, crowned King of Scots while still very young. His marriage to Joan, Edward III's sister, was meant to seal peace through blood. Yet marriages do not stop armies if powerful men decide the time is right for conquest. And in the early 1330s, many powerful men did decide it was right. The danger came from two directions at once. One was England itself, newly steadier under Edward III. The other was a group of disinherited Scottish nobles, men who had lost lands and power under Bruce's settlement. These men did not simply resent Bruce personally. They resented the new order that had been built on his victory. They wanted their estates back. They wanted their status restored. They wanted the clock turned backward to a Scotland where their families had not been punished for betting on the wrong side. They found their figurehead in Edward Balliol, the son of John Balliol. Edward Balliol's claim was the kind that could be used like a key. Even if he lacked the charisma or force to win Scotland alone, he offered something that England and the disinherited both needed: a plausible alternative kingship. If Balliol could be placed on Scotland's throne, then England could claim it was not conquering Scotland, only supporting the rightful king. That framing was a familiar medieval strategy. It turned invasion into assistance, and it made occupation easier to justify. The disinherited nobles, sometimes called the disinherited, gathered support and planned an invasion. Their timing was perfect in a cynical way. Scotland was under a child king. The realm was governed by guardians and powerful families managing regency politics. Unity was harder to maintain without Bruce's authority. Meanwhile, England, under Edward III, was gaining confidence, and many English nobles still viewed the peace treaty of 1328 as a humiliation. They wanted revision, revenge, and reward. In 1332, Balliol and his supporters landed in Scotland. Their forces were not enormous compared to what England could field, but they were seasoned and motivated, and they benefited from Scottish division. The campaign quickly became violent and destabilizing. The key early clash came at Duplin Moor, near Perth, where Balliol's forces defeated a larger Scottish army. The battle is remembered for tactics that foreshadow later English successes. Disciplined infantry and archers used effectively against Scottish formations. The shock of the defeat was profound. Scotland had not expected to be beaten so quickly by an invading force that was, in simple numbers, not overwhelming. Balliol was crowned, and for a brief moment, it looked as if the Bruce settlement might collapse in the space of a single season. But Balliol's rule was brittle. He depended on foreign support and on a faction of nobles whose loyalty was tied to what they could gain. He did not have deep national legitimacy. Many Scots did not accept him, and resistance quickly began to form around the defense of David II's kingship and the achievements of Bruce's reign. In 1333, England's involvement sharpened. Edward III moved more openly, leading a campaign that included the siege of Berwick, always that strategic border town, returning as the hinge of war. The Scots tried to relieve it, and the effort led to the Battle of Halidon Hill. There, Scotland suffered a devastating defeat. Again, English archers and well-positioned forces inflicted catastrophic losses. It was one of the worst Scottish defeats of the wars, and it revealed a grim pattern. When Scotland fought on England's chosen ground without adequate protection from arrows, it bled terribly. The aftermath was severe. Berwick fell. Balliol's regime seemed strengthened. English influence spread, and Scotland's independence, so recently recognized, looked suddenly fragile again. Yet something important did not break: Scottish refusal. The difference between this crisis and earlier ones was that Scotland now had a political identity forged by decades of struggle. The memory of Wallace and the victories of Bruce had become part of the realm's sense of itself. Even when the battlefield went badly, many Scots no longer accepted the idea of being ruled by England as normal. They had tasted what independence meant, at least the possibility of it, and that taste does not disappear easily. Resistance reorganized again, led by guardians and nobles loyal to the Bruce line. This is where the war turns into a long, stubborn contest of endurance. Balliol's authority waxed and waned. English support could place him in power in some regions, but holding Scotland against sustained resistance was costly and unstable. Castles could be garrisoned, towns could be punished, but rebellion kept returning because the political legitimacy Balliol needed could not be manufactured by English soldiers alone. Scotland's leaders made a decision that shows how dire the situation was. They sent David II to France for safety. A child king is a symbol, and symbols are dangerous when enemies can capture them. By sending David abroad, Scotland protected the continuity of the Bruce claim. France, long connected to Scotland through alliances and shared interests against England, became the place where the Scottish king could survive while Scotland fought on. In this way, the conflict became more international again, tied into broader European rivalries. Within Scotland, the war became a struggle of local actions, raids, castle recoveries, shifting control, the slow rebuilding of strength. Over time, English attention was also pulled in new directions. Edward III's ambitions were not confined to Scotland. His reign would soon be consumed by conflicts with France, the opening phases of what we call the 100 Years' War. That wider war mattered for Scotland because it divided England's resources and focus. A kingdom fighting on multiple fronts is always forced to prioritize, and Scotland learned to survive in the spaces created by England's divided attention. By the early 1340s, Balliol's position had weakened. Maintaining a rival kingship in Scotland was expensive and politically awkward. English nobles might have wanted Scottish submission, but their priorities were shifting toward France and continental ambitions. Scotland's resistance, though battered, persisted. One by one, positions were recovered. The Bruce cause reasserted itself, not with a single glorious turning battle like Bannockburn, but through the slow erosion of Balliol's support. In 1341, David II returned from France to Scotland, no longer a child, but still young, stepping into a realm that had fought for his name while he was away. His return was a hopeful moment, but it also carried danger. Scotland needed not only a king, but a king capable of commanding loyalty and navigating the same brutal political environment that had challenged Bruce. David had not been hardened by the same years of guerrilla war and survival that had shaped his father. He had been formed in a French court. That difference would matter. The war story, however, was not finished, and England's larger conflicts did not eliminate its interest in Scotland. In 1346, Scotland would face a catastrophic moment at Neville's Cross, where David II was captured by the English. The capture of a king is always a crisis because it unravels authority and invites chaos. It also becomes leverage. A king can be ransomed, traded, used to pressure the realm into concessions. That capture marks a turning point beyond the scope of this chapter's main arc, but it underlines the central truth. Scotland's independence, though recognized once, had to be defended again and again. The wars did not end neatly. They mutated. They returned. They tested each generation. And through all of it, the memory of Wallace remained strangely persistent. Wallace was not alive to see Bruce crowned, to see Bannockburn, to see treaties signed and broken. Yet his story lived as a moral touchstone. When Scotland faced occupation again, people remembered the earlier occupation. When Scotland faced collaborators again, people remembered those who had hunted Wallace. When Scotland faced the temptation to accept English dominance as inevitable again, they remembered a man who had refused inevitability and died for it. David II's era was a reminder that independence is not a single achievement. It is a condition that must be maintained through power, unity, and sometimes through suffering. The Bruce crown had survived its first great test, but it would face more. England's ambitions would not disappear. Scottish internal politics would not become gentle. The border would remain a scar that could reopen. In the next chapter, we'll close our narrative loop back to William Wallace more directly. How his memory was shaped, how later generations turned him into symbol and legend, and how the historical Wallace can still be seen through the layers of myth. Because for a 2-hour story, Wallace's life is only the beginning. His afterlife, how Scotland remembered him, is part of the history too. William Wallace's life ends in London in August 1305, but his story doesn't end there. In some ways, the real power of Wallace begins only after his death, because the moment a man is executed for a cause, the cause often gains a new kind of weapon. Not a sword or a spear, but a memory sharp enough to outlast the generation that witnessed it. If Edward I believed he was solving a problem by killing Wallace publicly, he misunderstood what Scotland was becoming. You can terrify people into silence for a time, but fear is not the same as agreement. And when the fear lifts, even briefly, what remains is the thing people were forced not to say. Wallace's execution was intended to teach Scotland submission. Instead, it helped teach Scotland that the struggle had become too deep to be ended by one death. Historically, Wallace's afterlife begins almost immediately. We see it in how his name persists, even as Scotland's political leadership changes. Robert the Bruce's rise does not erase Wallace. It absorbs him. The resistance that Bruce built needed more than strategy. It needed meaning. It needed a story that could remind Scots why the war mattered when the cost felt unbearable. Wallace served that purpose naturally. He was the man who had refused when refusal seemed impossible. He was the man who had made English occupation bleed at Stirling Bridge. He was the man the English had tried to destroy as an example every time Scotland faced danger again, every time England returned, every time a noble wavered, every time someone argued that peace under English authority might be easier. Wallace's name could be spoken like a rebuke. But if Wallace becomes a symbol quickly, the symbol does not stay clean. Symbols attract stories the way fire attracts wind. The sources closest to Wallace's time are limited, and that limitation is part of why later legend grows so large. Medieval Scotland did not leave us a modern-style biography of Wallace, written by someone who followed him year by year. What we have are chronicles, letters, administrative records, and later retellings, some closer to the events, some written much later with different purposes. In that gap, imagination stepped in. The most influential expansion of Wallace's story comes from a poem composed in the 15th century, often linked to a figure known as Blind Harry. That poem made Wallace into something like Scotland's perfect hero, unyielding, almost superhuman, carrying a personal narrative of romance and vengeance and patriotic certainty. It gave Scotland what oppressed nations often build in their hardest times, a single figure who embodies everything the country wishes it could be. The poem is powerful, and it shaped the emotional memory of Wallace for centuries, but it is not a contemporary record in the strict sense. It is history, braided with national longing. That matters for your channel because you've asked for accuracy. Accuracy doesn't mean stripping the story of feeling. It means being honest about where the feeling comes from. The historical Wallace we can glimpse is still extraordinary, even without the later flourishes. He emerges suddenly in the record as a leader during a national crisis. He strikes an English official at a moment when that is effectively a declaration of war. He joins the wider uprising that includes Andrew de Moray, and together they engineer one of the most tactically significant victories of the period at Stirling Bridge. He becomes Guardian of Scotland, trying to hold together a realm under occupation. He faces Edward I's full strength and is defeated at Falkirk. He resigns his guardianship, yet continues to resist as the net tightens. He is captured, tried, and executed as a traitor to a king he did not acknowledge. That is the core arc we can support historically, and it is more than enough to explain why his name would endure. But legend does not grow only because people want to embellish. It grows because the man's historical role touches something enduring in human nature. The hunger for a figure who stands when everyone else bends. This is why Wallace is often remembered in ways that blur the complicated politics around him. In real history, Scotland's resistance was not always unified. Nobles shifted. Some submitted. Some fought. Some fought, then submitted, then fought again. The war was messy and full of self-interest. Wallace's legend, by contrast, offers clarity. He becomes the image of refusal without negotiation, patriotism without compromise. That clarity is comforting and motivating, especially in later centuries when Scotland's national identity faced new pressures and needed anchoring stories. And the memory was not only literary, it became physical. Monuments were raised. Places associated with him became part of the landscape of remembrance. His name became shorthand for the idea that Scotland had once faced the most powerful king in England and refused to accept the world as England wanted it to be. Even popular culture, centuries later, helped carry that memory outward. Modern films and novels introduced Wallace to audiences far beyond Scotland, often with dramatic liberties, sometimes with distortions. Those versions are not the history, but they are part of the afterlife. They show how Wallace continues to function as a universal figure, the outsider who rises, the rebel who fights empire, the man who loses his life but wins a kind of immortality. For your channel, the key is to hold both truths gently at once. The real Wallace was not a flawless saint carved from marble. He was a medieval war leader in a brutal time, using brutal methods, operating in a political landscape full of shifting loyalties. Yet the reason the legend sticks is because at the heart of the real story, there is a simple, unignorable fact. Wallace did not accept conquest as permanent. He forced England to pay a price. He proved resistance could be organized, could be effective, could win, and when he died as a man who refused to call Edward his king. That refusal, on its own, is enough to echo. If you step back far enough, Wallace's story is also a reminder of how history actually works. Nations are not reshaped only by kings, nor only by battlefields. They're reshaped by moments when ordinary people begin to believe the future is not fixed. Wallace was one of those moments made human. When he rose, Scotland's independence looked like something that could be erased. After his rise, independence looked like something that could be fought for. And after his death, the fight did not end, because by then, the idea had taken root in too many minds. That's the strange moral of Wallace, and it is why he belongs in the same story as Bruce and Bannockburn and Arbroath and the long, difficult years that followed. Wallace is not the whole war. He is the spark in the dark part of it. The moment when the country's refusal becomes visible and dangerous and impossible to ignore. And if you listen carefully across the centuries, you can hear what that spark became. The Declaration of Arbroath arguing that Scotland fights for freedom. Bruce standing his ground at Bannockburn. Later generations, even after treaties were broken and wars returned, still finding strength in the same memory. That once, when the world seemed decided, a man rose and said it wasn't. That is why Wallace endures. Not because every legend attached to him is true, but because the core truth at the center of his life is powerful enough to survive the legends. And now, as we reach the end of our journey tonight, let the noise of battle fade back into the distance. Let the hoofbeats soften. Let the shouts dissolve into the wind over the hills. Let the cold river run quietly again beneath its bridge, carrying only moonlight. If you're still awake, thank you for being here with me. Through Scotland's dark years, through rising hope, through the long struggle that shaped a nation. And if you're listening as you fall asleep, I hope this story has helped your mind slow down and drift into something calmer. Before you go, feel free to leave a comment telling me where you listened from tonight. And if you'd like more long, gentle history stories for sleep, you can subscribe and join us again next time. For now, let your shoulders drop, let your breathing settle into an easy rhythm. The past can be heavy, but tonight, you don't have to carry it. Good night, and sleep well.